and welcome to the Weekend Report with Sheila, Zilinsky, and the Hagmann, the instigator and the investigators for August 2nd, 2014. Folks, we have an incredible show tonight. Joining me this first hour is Christopher C. Horner, New York Times bestselling author, Washington attorney, and outspoken political critic of climate science. He wrote Red Hot Lies, How Global Warming Alarmists Use Threats, Fraud, and Deception to Keep You Misinformed, the politically incorrect guide to global warming and environmentalism, Power Grab, and more recently, the liberal war on transparency. He's got a very long list of impressive credentials, and I'm a big fan. I've read his books. Impressive. Chris Horner, welcome to the program, sir.
Thank you, Sheila.
It is a real pleasure to finally have you on. Listen, Chris, you know, the one thing you and I have in common is we're touted as climate criminals. And what is very staggering to me is that this cabal of collectivists can get away with pinning us as climate deniers. I've never denied the climate changes. In fact, when I was a kid, I called it weather. And I think nothing annoys warmists more than to be told that their favorite earth-destroying trace gas, CO2, is in fact harmless and beneficial plant food. So I've asked this question for years, Chris. When did CO2 become a deadly pollutant?
Well, that's a very good question because it remains what we were taught in school, plant food, right? They inhale it and then subject us to the horrors of photosynthesis, exhaling it, exhaling oxygen, and we, rinse, repeat. It's a very beneficial relationship. And yet somehow when they realized their alternative was to recognize that as wealthy and growing societies do, we were now clean. They could either acknowledge that or invent a new pollutant. And I don't have a date for this, but then again, they can't tell us when the science was settled now, can they? That seems like I don't know when CO2 went from being an odorless, colorless, benign, actually very beneficial gas necessary for life on Earth, turned into I was watching a show on the History Channel, which was perfectly fine up till the end, and I think in order to check a box to satisfy the grant they got to make the show, it was about volcanoes. They then started talking about deadly carbon dioxide.
Deadly.
Now, my children were looking at me as I'm yelling back at the television, going, "What, Dad, what?" I'm saying, "Oh, goodness, you're about to commence a young lifetime of hearing this nonsense now, so let me explain it to you." So I don't know when that turn happened, but they can't tell me when the science was settled. Was it a debate? Was it a paper? A zinger? Like, where's the beef? Something Al Gore said or invented, or was it maybe an IPCC proclamation, since that's what they do?
Well, here's the thing. The science is unsettling, more like it. But this science is settled mantra, the debate is over. What debate? There's never been a debate. And I think it's interesting that George Will once said, Chris, when a politician says the debate is over, you can be sure of two things. The debate is raging and he's losing it. So right. I don't know if it started with good old Maurice Strong or the good old, as they tell the people, the Club of Rome, premier environmental think tank, consultants to the UN. I mean, look at what he said years ago. The common enemy of humanity is man. Essentially, he said, in searching for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famines, and the like would fit the bill. All these dangers are caused by human intervention, and it is only through changed attitudes and behaviors that they can be overcome. So the real enemy then is humanity itself. I mean, when he went further on to say, isn't the only hope for the planet that industrialized civilizations collapse, and isn't our responsibility to bring that about? I mean, that is pretty big anti-growth, anti-population, global governance kind of mantras, is it not?
Well, if you distill this, it's like an awful lot of their agenda. It really comes down to one thing. Obviously, it isn't about climate. I mean, it's not rationally about climate. Now, the kids on campus and so on who desperately need it to be about climate or haven't really looked into it, okay, to them it's about climate. But rationally, it can't be. We know what it's not about. Nothing ever proposed would detectably impact climate. The temperature after Kyoto will be, let me carry the one, whatever it would have been without it. There's a consensus on that. Not 97% manufactured of scientists they never spoke to, but 100% of these computer models on which the entire agenda is premised say it will have no impact on climate, so it won't. Now, what is it about? It's about population. To most of them, it's about people. I need to preface this, other people. When environmentalists talk about people, they mean people. When people like Maurice Strong, who I testified next to, by the way, at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, a hearing on these multilateral treaties, and he is the most you'd never know this mild-mannered,
he's very unassuming, isn't he?
Unassuming seeming, but he says these things that, you know what, you only hear from people who've already become very wealthy and think it's a great time to stop. And they got theirs, and so they start complaining about people, and they always mean other people. P.J. O'Rourke in America wrote, they view the world as having just enough of them, way too many of you and me. And it's always about people. People are pollution, but again, they mean other people. They use Orwellian terms like depopulate, because without showing leadership, mind you, and volunteering somehow, they don't take that sort of leadership. They talk about other people who can't be born. We need to get down to, I think it's 2 billion people. When I went to law school, the joke was that they no longer said these things. They used to say, look to your left, look to your right. One of them is going to go, because they used to actually weed people out of law school back then. And now it's, from the environmentalist perspective, since we've got 6+ billion people in the world, they say you can only have 2+ billion. They say look to your left, look to your right. They both got to go. It's about other people. It's about other people who shouldn't be here, who shouldn't be born, who shouldn't do this, who shouldn't do that, and they should be the ones who make the decision. But I assure you, it can't be about climate, because nothing they've ever proposed would impact the climate according to their own very expensive taxpayer-funded PlayStations, these computer models on which they ground this whole thing.
Well, you're right, and the article of faith among the neo-Malthusian greenies is that the world is getting far too crowded and something's got to be done. Good old Paul Ehrlich latched onto the Malthus doom scenario, and hence out came his population bomb. And today, thanks to the good old Goddard Institute for Space Studies, or GISS, NASA has become one of the world's foremost proponents of climate change alarmism, and thanks to the expert adjustments of its former director, our pal James Hansen, shows more extreme weather than ever before. Isn't that incredible?
NASA is now a global warming agency. It has just completed its transformation. Previously, they had, with the reduction in space funding and so on, they saw, well, like they asked Willie Sutton, the famous bank robber, why did he rob the banks, Willie? And he said, that's where the money is. Well, NASA, why did you become a global warming agency? Well, it was this seemingly endless gusher of taxpayer money. And so they had a guy who was known as the world's leading climate scientist, kind of like the head of the IPCC, who's a railway engineer. But, hey, he feels the UN's really neat, so he's the world's leading climate scientist. And then James Hansen, who's an astronomer of all things, and they said, well, he's a world's leading climate scientist, and he set up this operation, and they were just trucking in the taxpayer money. He brought in a protege who just took over for him, who was a climate modeler. NASA has now completed the transformation to become a global warming agency, which is we like to talk about what the founders would be saying if they were here today. Just the people who founded NASA would be just appalled by this, that this is what an erstwhile, wonderful institution, which with the private sector did great things, has become, and simply because it's a lot easier than working for a living to run around shrieking about the end of the world just over the horizon and give me a bag of money and I'll look into it. Although, by the way, it's settled, but give me a bigger bag of money anyway.
Well, look back to 2007 when GISS was forced to revise its figures after Hansen was caught adjusting U.S. surface temperature data, making early years look cooler, and he claimed that the 90s were the hottest years on record when the 1930s were the hottest. Think about this, folks. James Hansen raked in a whopping $1.6 million for being NASA's resident alarmist, plus an estimated how many millions in traveling around the globe for his so-called wisdom. So, it's fortune and ritzy vacations when you jump into bed with Big Eco.
When it was Steve McIntyre from Toronto, who found that Hansen had been sexing up temperatures.
And Ross McKintrick. They both tried to.
Right. And I sent a Freedom of Information Act request to look into what they were saying about how to respond to this. And it was quite something. Hansen clearly didn't know what his old papers had said. He kept being reminded in these emails by his staff that, well, you're the one who said 1938, and you're the one who said this, and you're the one who said that. And he just runs around spouting off angrily about what he feels and then gets his staff to say, well, okay, you actually said the following. Well, I found reporters like Andy Revkin of the New York Times writing to them, look, I can no longer not write about this, so give me your take. In other words, this is all over. The dog has slipped the leash. I need you to give me your spin so I can write a story about how something we didn't think was newsworthy to begin with is really something that people need to not pay attention to. I mean, it's just a remarkable study. Well, that led me into finding other things and continuing to pursue and have to sue NASA. And I'll tell you, it was my FOIA that got those records showing he pulled in $1.8 million from outside sources in personal income, including, by the way, he even served as a consultant to a Canadian law firm to block oil sands production while he was at NASA.
Right.
He was just, it was, all these things came up about all his travel and his honoraria that got me to start asking about that. I got his ethics forms. It was really good to be James Hansen. Now, after we showed he was supplementing his taxpayer income of $180,000 with double that on the side, he obviously was no longer going to be a great witness as NASA's James Hansen, and it wasn't as good to be James Hansen, and he retired to be a full-time agitator, not on the taxpayer dime. But that's just a case study, Sheila, in how these agencies, when they're given wealth transfers, that's how they subsist, not on being productive, but on taking money, robbing Peter to pay Paul, and they're Paul, they can get really not only quite full of themselves, but out ahead of their skis and just saying whatever in the world seems to work, and it works until some taxpayer watchdogs come along and start asking questions. There you see how this thing can get out of control. It gets out of control not just because of the people who've made their money and now are funding an effort to stop other people from making money, Maury Strong, but taxpayer outfits are driving an awful lot of this, and you need to start looking into it because this is an absolutely improper use of your money.
Well, and then look at Michael Mann. I mean, thanks to his Al Gore-endorsed school children scaring, politician galvanizing hockey stick. I mean, you're right. Steve McIntyre and Ross McKintrick, they, just so folks know, they tried to replicate the most famous of all the climatological reconstructions and was stonewalled by Michael Mann at every turn. And it's interesting, but McIntyre pressed on, and what he discovered was that Mann's graph relied on a computer algorithm that was so skewed that it would produce a hockey stick more than 99% of the time, regardless of what data you fed into it. In other words, Mann had fudged it, and it was comprehensively debunked. So, and then you look at the good old, as I call them, the intergovernmental pack of climate crooks, it's the IPCC. I mean, according to Obama, it's the gold standard of international climate science. But the truth is, Chris, it was set up in a fit of panic in about 1988 when people were actually gullible enough to be suckered into them attributing warming to man. And like you just alluded to, it's run by the good old yoga-loving, ice-shunning, bearded railway engineer Pachauri, and each of their 5 assessment reports have been out to lunch, and the latest IPCC report has truly sunk to a level of what I call hilarious incoherence. They're proclaiming increased confidence in all these models as the discrepancy between their models and observations increase. Isn't that just complete mindlessness?
You have to wonder how far apart their projections and reality have to get for them to be 100% certain. I mean,
instead of 95% certain that man is causing anthropogenic global warming.
Right. They get more confident each time as reality and their computer model projections diverge. So,
I mean, how much longer, Chris, can the IPCC maintain this charade? I mean, how long before its machinations are understood enough by leaders to elicit some backbone here? Because it's quite amazing to see the contortions the IPCC has to go through in order to keep the international climate change agenda going. And now Al Gore's out there calling it's not even climate change, it's not global warming, it's climate crises. The Environmental Protection Agency just last week, this was mind-numbing to me, that they are completely, this heavily armed SWAT team, and they're conducting these commando-style raids on, Alaskan spas and vehicles. And, I mean, it's absolutely just egregious that the ecosystem may be out another, 165,000, but they're saying, well, that's a small price to pay for environmental justice. You have these kooks off there trying to jail us, criminal deniers. I mean, don't you think it's mindlessness?
Well, it's clearly mindless when we have the president running around calling an organization whose own website says they don't perform any science as the gold standard of climate science. This is something of a racket. Saul Zilinsky, this activist organizer from Chicago that Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama emulated. or emulate and idolize, made clear that the issue isn't the issue. It's kind of like isolating people, something the alarmists do: isolate, attack, and ridicule, and make everything ad hominem to avoid the merits. It's like George Will saying, when somebody says the debate is over, you can be sure it's raging. Claiming the debate is over is the best way to avoid having one, and you do that when the merits aren't in your favor, and you go ad hominem, and they do all of this. Now, given that, can it continue? At this rate? Well, people don't have to actually write the check like they do for their electricity bill. So it can go on for a lot longer, but as the eminent man said once, those things that can't go on forever won't. IPCC seems to see that there is a horizon for them, that maybe they've reached their half-life, and that is recently, I don't know, maybe 2 years ago, Pachauri made a suggestion that maybe they could be a sustainability organization. Yeah, that's it. We'll be a sustainability group, which is normally, it's the end of the world, right? You don't just walk away from the end of the world. You were running around assuring us the end of the world, and now you want to say, how about sustainability? That's really how about that? Will that work? Keep this gravy train going, man. We love it. We've got people from all over the world gladly willing to sell their names to say, oh, yes, I'm on board, in order to be flown out of usually terrible situations to beautiful places 4 times a year at minimum to meet on our dime, and as we've seen, dine very well with drivers and so on, in order just to saying that and be called the world's leading climate scientists from places who have no science budget, simply for joining on and saying, look at us, we've got a Noah's Ark of people supporting us, it must be right. Now, that kind of operation, as I think I and you have accurately described it, really can't go on forever, but because the money's washed through some wealthy nations and because they're very adaptable in, for example, finding some way to continue this traveling circus. The first time it was China and India, et cetera, saying, well, of course, and the wealthy countries, Europe, saying, well, of course these people join on the second time. So U.S., you just do it the first time. And then when it came to the second round, they said, well, of course these people don't have to sign on the second round. They're going to do it on the third. You just sign here. As long as they get this free pass from people like I've mentioned at the New York Times and others, it'll go on for much longer than it should have. It's already gone on much, much longer than it should have. But I just don't see it being in perpetuity. And by their volunteering to be instead I don't know, what's trendy, sustainability group, they seem to recognize it can't go on forever, too. Now, that's a far cry from actually ending it, but, hey, it's a start.
Again, anyone who questions their agenda, though, is written off as some kind of, tinfoil hat kook, or we said before, the climate criminal, as you've been touted as. I mean, we've got the professor with Rothschild Institute of Technology, Lawrence Torsello, people can punch that in a search, and he's a philosopher over at University of Buffalo, and he is actually saying, he's arguing that these malignant individuals, who he doesn't identify, of course, but he's saying, it's a campaign funding misinformation about climate change, and he goes on to say, Chris, that, this kind of activity ought to be considered criminally negligent, and people that deny should go to jail. And then, of course, I don't know if you know this, Chris, but a few months ago, we had a debate with Christopher Keating. He put out this challenge that he would pay $30,000 to anyone that could prove calling us all deniers. And he said, the science is settled. And then he quotes off GIS information. So here's a scientist. He's actually a physics professor, and he taught at the University of South Dakota and for the U.S. Naval Academy. But he issued a challenge saying anybody who can scientifically disprove global warming, he was going to pay $30,000 to, and according to a news release, he actually put up that money. But the thing is, he won't let anyone come up with anything that disputes NASA information. So, he's not going to whip out his checkbook because, he says it can't be proven. So,
he's saying, if anybody can prove my source doesn't say what my source says, then I'll give you some money. But nobody can prove that your source doesn't say what your source says. I can prove your source isn't credible. We need to get this thing tried. We need to try the issue of global warming, and we are trying. I won't get into the weeds, but we're setting that up here. We're going to put the science on trial. In short, the entire parade of horribles these regulations are based upon are premised upon warming. The entirety of the warming is premised upon a very sensitive climate. Well, that's absolutely disproved by, it's very technical, but looking out the window. Their models have been proved wrong. Now, we will get that to court. In the meantime, you have people like this with their stunts who, by the way, when he made this challenge, listed off a bunch of things as getting worse and increasing, which aren't. And if you can't agree with somebody on what's going on outside the window, don't take their offer of some money if you do X or Y seriously, particularly when on its face it was unserious. It was if you can prove, we have to, we're going by whatever NASA says, run by part of Climate Inc., but if you can prove that they don't say what they say, why, I'll give you some money. Well, of course, none of these are serious challenges. I think I have an idea. Why don't you put some energy like that into making your case? Because if they could make their case, they would have. If they had an argument instead of that stunt, they would make it. Instead, they do what you said. You claim the debate is over in order to avoid the debate. When you find out, doggone it, there's a debate happening anyway, then you move on into all the other nonsense, including demonizing anybody who dares challenge you, and the rhetorical games and then the menacing revelations about what you want to do when you finally win, what you said about we need to criminally prosecute people who disagree with us. In Red Hot Lies, the book you mentioned at the beginning, I have a whole discussion of examples of people, not just academics and journalists and activists, but people in sort of positions of authority, the people who drive the supposed unbiased objective information and agenda, also saying the same thing, particularly out of the United Nations, but elsewhere, all saying we need essentially, as one of them said, Nuremberg-style trials for these expletive deleteds. Wow, you must really feel confident if you're already thinking about how can I jail these people who I can't get out of my way.
It's incredible. Well, now switching gears a little bit, when Power Grab came out, there was one story in there that I want you to recount, how you got involved in your field, your Enron story. Why would they be going along with Kyoto Treaty, anti-energy policies and lovely things like that. Tell our listeners the light bulb moment for you, Chris.
Okay, so I had worked for a Democratic member of the United States Senate from the Northeast on environment issues. That was my introduction. I stuck around. I was innocently practicing law in Washington, pause, wait for laughter, when a company asked me to be director of federal government relations. This was 1997. There was no Kyoto Treaty yet, though later in the year there would be. This was in the spring. It was everybody's favorite company, particularly the Clinton White House, as well as Governor Bush in Texas. Everybody loved them. They were called a free market pioneer by people who liked markets, and they were hailed as a global warming leader by Teresa Heinz and the Heinz Foundation because they were underwriting, as I later learned, the global warming industry, which they thought would make them rich, rich, rich. Here's what happened. So I took the job as Director of Federal Government Relations for Enron. Now, I was only there a few weeks because on my first or second day, I walked into my boss's office, and she was meeting with Sierra Club and NRDC, Natural Resources Defense Council. I backed out slowly. Oh, okay, maybe we're trying to find common ground. The next day, which, by the way, isn't all it's cracked up to be, the next day, I sit in for Ken Lay at a meeting of a group of what we call Baptists and bootleggers, people with nothing in common except for a shared interest in prohibition, and that they're going to view the other as the useful idiot to advance an ideologically aligned agenda. They both want to see prohibition of, let's say, energy sources that work. So I go in this room, and around the table are the Union of Concerned Scientists and other moonbat organizations. Sorry, but I mean the ultimate extreme. Well, there are enviro-terrorists out there, of course, eco-terrorists quite a lot. But of the mainstream groups, these are the really radical groups. And the American Gas Association, BP, Niagara Mohawk Power, Enron. And I turned to the general counsel of one of the groups I named and asked, what in the world are we doing sitting around a table with people who want to put us out of business? And he said something like, yeah, I know. I don't know either, but they want to put coal out of business first. So I couldn't believe it. I didn't know about rent-seeking, which is making your money the old-fashioned way through favors from your friends in government, the world's second oldest profession. I didn't know about Baptist and bootlegger coalitions like this. And I go back to my office at Enron, and I send an email to my boss saying, what is this group that, well, it turned out you founded with BP up to? And did you know the following? And, well, that didn't go over too well. They said, look, I want to explain our business model to you. This was a no-interview job offer, essentially, we gave you. I didn't know them, but they knew me, knew of me, whatever. They thought I'd be good at their company. As everybody said, leap at the chance. Well, they explained, look, We're a gas company, of course, and imagine how much money we'll make if we regulated coal out of business. That's the obvious one. Oh, yeah, I thought. They had the world's largest gas pipe network outside of Gazprom. Okay. But they had just bought the U.S.'s largest windmill company, which is now known as GE Wind and is not quite so big, but it was called Zondwind at the time. It was uneconomic. They bought it on the cheap because it's not economic. But Ken Lay, being a political capitalist, had also bought a bunch of solar, I think the second largest solar entity in the country. It might have been the world's largest windmill company at the time, Zond. And then he bought these things on the cheap because they were dogs, and then set about spending money lobbying and underwriting groups to go scare people into accepting an agenda that would funnel billions of dollars to these companies that he bought on the cheap because they were uneconomic. Well, I just described what's going on with wind and solar and anything else that they're trying to get you to underwrite, pixie dust, flubber, whatever, on the argument that, the other is killing the planet, you see. We've run out of pollution arguments, so we had to now say CO2 is a pollutant. And I know how cynical this sounds, by the way, but as you pointed out, Sheila, I was in the room. It's true. This is what was going on and what is going on. So this wind and solar cabal, Enron and BP and some others, rent seekers, orchestrate this coalition of groups to go after energy sources that work, even though they had a little bit of that too, because of the enormous wealth transfers that would come their way, as we have seen in these 17 years since, if they scared people into believing that if you rob the taxpayer just a little bit more every year to pay for my windmills and things, why, we'll be saving the planet from catching on fire. And it was a great business model until things collapsed due to, some would say, unrelated factors, but I think I was somewhat prescient when I left very soon thereafter. This was a company trying to make money off of doing nothing. And so while I may have looked like a crazy man on the street corner muttering into my surgical mask for a few years about this bad company that they're trying to make money doing nothing, which shocked almost nobody in Washington. It shocked me. Well, when the collapse came, then people said, oh, yeah. I had an interview with the Washington Post for about an hour where I explained this in actually more long-winded form. And at the end, the reporter said, and the story ran around Christmas Day of 2001, I think, maybe 2002. And because they were trying to tie Enron to Bush. And he said, well, I suppose what you're telling me, I could say that what you're telling me is they weren't that bad after all. And he goes, I mean, global warming. I thought, they saw you coming and many others like you. Well, if I just wave my arms and yell global warming, people won't notice I'm picking their pocket. And that's what they were all about.
So, you really were seeing how the green groups, scare people into accepting these streams of revenue transfers and robbing Peter to pay Paul. You saw that with Enron and BP, and the Greens wetting their backs along the way. That must be eye-opening for someone like you to see this rent-seeking, making the money the old-fashioned way, is it? Because through all these policies, it really led you on a real interesting path to looking at so-called transparency, didn't it? And which will springboard, of course, into your book, The Liberal War on Transparency. But, it's amazing. You even point out the Obama administration promising to be the most transparent administration in history. Excuse me while I laugh. How's that working out, Chris?
Yeah, well, I think what they meant by that, I've decoded it for about 2 years. What they meant was those Bush things, if you want them, we'll get them right overnight. In fact, we found they overnight things to allies, even groups you've never heard of. We'll get overnight treatment, and if some things are redacted, they complain, they get it FedExed to them the next day. Guess who's paying for that? We are. And meanwhile, I have to sue for things that belong to me every single time because, as I've, in 2 emails from 2 separate lawyers at EPA in 2 separate offices, General Counsel and Office of the Administrator, they've told me, anything from you or any group affiliated with you, we set aside for special treatment. They slow walk and hide things because I'm after the things they don't want to release. When he said transparent, he meant we're going to get that Bush stuff out right away, toot sweet. However, when it comes to our correspondence, communications, as the book, Liberal War and Transparency, details, they had all sorts of tricks up their sleeve to make sure not just they would stonewall me, but when I found out what they were up to, for example, they moved government over to Gmail. They moved government over to text messaging. They would use private email accounts to set up meetings off campus, like Sierra Club meets with EPA across the street at the Starbucks at the JW Marriott. Now, they're not in the visitor logs where somebody looking would look, and so on. And when I go pulling those threads, well, I'm finding all these memes they had. They even encouraged, I have a PowerPoint I obtained that shows that they encourage staff to set up chat rooms through Yahoo and AOL, you see, because then they're not on a government computer server. And they encouraged, why don't you have your friends with outside groups set them up so you're just dropping in and then dropping out. I found the White House, for the IPCC, setting up privately owned computer servers, privately run by a pressure group at a private university, therefore not subject to Freedom of Information Act requests. They have set up a computer server for each IPCC working group after the Climategate leaks and after my FOIAs to what NOAA and NASA here. They set up what they call safe houses, sort of dead drops, where the servers run by the Carnegie Endowment at Stanford University that the White House Office of Science and Technology and others drop in on. IPCC lead authors drop in, do their work remotely there, presumably free from prying taxpayer eyes, and we found the letter where this was executed. And this all came, we learned all this through Climategate when Phil Jones and others, these key actors in that episode, were talking about, I'll do anything other than turn over these emails that belong to the taxpayer. Well, that's what they did. And so when the administration said most transparent, they sure weren't talking about themselves.
Well, it's spectacular, the lengths, Chris, they've gone to, falsify things, moving, criminal documentation, destruction, very elaborate stages of absolutely going to great extremes. And, this is the sort of theme running through your book and the number of areas where it's taken place. And I think back to Lisa Jackson and EPA, and, it's just unbelievable, and the anti-coal groups. You were looking into that. Tell us how that evolved.
Well, we had a feeling about how things were going and that they were doing what they were doing. So I ended up having to sue on numerous fronts, and we've got ongoing document productions for example, emails to, from, or mentioning the Sierra Club, or what's known as the prototypical example of a pay-to-play group, which surprises people, but it's called the American Lung Association, and others. And I said, well, okay, we know what they're doing. EPA has gone and hired activists from these groups to come inside. They brought in lawyers from NRDC, Sierra Club, and others to be activist lawyers, but at EPA. So we had to sue. I found, as I detailed in the book, for example, 2 FOIA officers, one of them told me that they were told to do no work on this request, and it was taken from them, and the guy sat on it. And I filed an affidavit to that effect, saying the guy, he's so terrified of this request, he pulled it from the people assigned to it and said, don't do anything on this. And he sat on it. Well, we had to sue, and I know why. The documents we've received show, they go across the street to the Marriott at Starbucks, and they use private email accounts. I found a false identity created for the EPA administrator. Just Friday of this week, I received text messages from EPA under a document production in a lawsuit, which proves one thing. They do preserve their text messages. They exist unless you destroy them.
Sure.
Well, I found the administrator, EPA's administrator, has admitted to us through the Department of Justice she destroyed every single one of hers. You heard about the Internal Revenue Service in Washington and how they moved over.
Boy, that's a real running theme, isn't it?
Well, we were on this. This lawsuit's been going for a long time. We were way ahead of them on Lois Lerner, and only now we know they do create these messages. I got her metadata, and they show she was texting like a teenager. She moved over from email to texting and then destroyed them all. We got her to admit that she destroyed 3,952 of them over the 3-year period. Well, I think a court is going to say, the law says you have to recreate the record. Until you do, no rules for you. We have found them doing all sorts of things to avoid you finding out what they're up to, and what they're up to is they're colluding. They're colluding improperly with groups who are ideologically aligned, but I'm sorry, they're not the government. And these folks fail to recognize that distinction. And so the tricks, they continue to reveal themselves through a lot of pressure from us. And the courts move very slowly, but we do hope that they'll move fairly and that we will get the result, which is this is simply not what our laws permit. You're going to have to stay these rules. You're going to have to try to recreate what you destroyed in this cyber bonfire we found. And you're going to have to let the taxpayer know what's been going on because, once again, they're doing this for a reason, Sheila. It's not the climate. It can't be the climate. Nothing ever proposed would detectably impact the climate. They've admitted the temperature after this will be the same as without it. They're doing it for a reason. So we have a right to find out if they won't tell us that. Although last week they did say it's actually an investment opportunity. That's why they're doing it. It's not a pollution control regime. This was testimony by the administrator.
Well, the issue has never been the issue. You've maintained that for a long time, and you're absolutely right. I mean, when I think about Carol Browner, the hard drive destruction, I mean, this is amazing. These are federal court order violations, and such a theme, like you said, destroying a hard drive. FBI goes in, does analysis on these different hard drives, whether it's IRS or these hucksters, and shrugging shoulder, little absolute virulently dumbed down answer, and it's crickets chirping. Oh, nothing to see here, folks. I mean, it is absolutely mind-numbing how these people can falsify identities for federal record-keeping purposes and yet get away with it. I mean, yeah, transparency, right.
Yeah, there's no account. I'll tell you what, the problem is, and we found this in the Rocky Mountain West, we found the regional administrator who came from a pressure group, still using his Gmail account to correspond with the pressure group. He's gone after he denied he even did it, and then ultimately got a lawyer, and he vomited up all these records, and we got them, and we saw what he's doing. And there's no accountability because he coughed up the records, but he knew enough to quit. Because once you're no longer at the agency, we have very little leverage over you. And so no one has been held accountable. Some people have left their jobs right after we got court orders. Lisa Jackson announced her resignation right when we got the court order saying they had to turn over her false identity emails from Richard Windsor.
Wasn't it her dog's name or something?
Well, it was she was trying to explain. We've still got an outstanding request on this. She was saying, she could have pulled it out of a phone book. Every email has to identify the party, and every other administrator's other account always identified them as Administrator Johnson, Administrator Whitman. This said Richard Windsor, who doesn't exist. She said, my dog's named Richard, and I'm from East Windsor, New Jersey. Don't you see? Well, that doesn't make it legal. You still didn't put below there Administrator Lisa Jackson, and there's no evidence that you were searching these for Freedom of Information Act requests. You adopt a false identity for a reason. Whatever it is, you won't tell us, but we do know that the one foreseeable outcome was you were going to frustrate record-keeping and transparency laws. So it's reasonable to conclude that that's why you did it. But it's a whole series of completely unrelated, isolated incidences, right? Well, she destroyed a hard drive, and yeah, she destroyed a hard drive, and yeah, this guy with the Pebble Mine destroyed his, and he's gone, and we can't find him. And Gina McCarthy went and destroyed all of her text messages, and Lisa Jackson adopted a false identity, and they're using private email accounts. But I tell you, these are all unrelated, isolated incidences. They do not reflect a pattern of trying to hide from you what we're doing.
Well, it's just the tip of the iceberg because they were using, AOL out of the White House and striking deals off the record and so on and so forth. I mean, private computers, private servers, nothing to see here, folks, right?
Right. But what are you hiding? I believe you. I desperately want to believe you. But why all of these examples of you doing what somebody who is less trusting than me would believe was designed to hide what you're up to? One time, all right, then there's a false identity, then there's another lost hard drive, then there's a destroyed hard drive, then there are thousands of destroyed text messages and so on in Gmail and meeting across the street. And okay, at some point, I'm not going to be Charlie Brown thinking Lucy's not going to pull the football away again. I'm starting to think these people are hiding what they're up to. That's pretty reasonable. I mean, three's a pattern under our racketeering law, for example, RICO. 3 times in 10 years is a pattern. Well, I've got an awful lot more than that. This rises to a pattern of destroying records and doing other things to make sure we can't see what they're doing. And I don't care why. All I know is we need a court, and we're on our way there, to say you're allowed to regulate, but not like this, and not in a great conflict, not in collusion, and not like this. Destroying records.
But what about congressional oversight, Chris?
Okay. they have been helpful. When you have a gavel, the administration will take you somewhat seriously because you have subpoena power, you have the ability, in theory, to enforce.
In theory, yeah.
Right, and put somebody in a jail if they don't want to comply. Now, that's in theory. What we've learned is since the Fast and Furious scandal about administration gun running into Mexico to sort of help their anti-gun campaign, which led to deaths, including of a border agent and so on. I mean, really, really cynical stuff. They decided to call the bluff of Congress. Right now, the opposition party holds the House of Representatives, but not the Senate. And so what we have had success with is when the opposition in the House, who say the Oversight and Government Reform Committee, when they say, I want these things, we have a decent chance of getting them. It doesn't help when a bunch of, let's say, the senior Republican on the Judiciary Committee, the Environment Committee, the Commerce Committee, all these committees get together, but they're still, in the White House's eyes, powerless Republicans who don't have a gavel. They're ignored. When Darrell Issa, with a gavel, says, I want these documents, we have a chance. When he says the following, things change, and that is 2 words, transcribed interview. That's when people start quitting. They have recovered memory syndrome kick in. Suddenly they remember all sorts of things they couldn't remember, and they reorient their career, which is they quit, they get a lawyer, they find a new job, and they turn over documents. When he says, I want you to come in and talk to me, and we're going to take it down, and I'm going to ask you to swear to tell the truth, at that point people get a little more straight with him, and they turn over documents. That's how we've had our best success. Congressional oversight is helpful. With divided Congress, it's not all that helps. It's somewhat, but not ideally helpful. If there was divided government, meaning, let's say, the Republicans control Congress and these people doing what we've described they're doing control the executive branch, I think you'd have a little more success getting things out. But I'll be honest with you, it's groups like us and Judicial Watch who are as long as it takes things from the courts that the administration is just, since Fast and Furious, they've decided, you know what, I'm going to try my luck. You didn't send me to jail. Eric Holder is still in his job. He didn't go to jail. Nobody went to jail. We're going to call your bluff. And so it really is. It's up to groups like us going to the courts, and courts can get things wrong too. That's why they created courts of appeal, which sometimes get it wrong when the trial court got it right. But we seem to have better luck, even if it takes a long time, doing a pincer movement.
Well, you've got these activist groups who are, asking questions who get an exemption for their fees under the law. And you just mentioned, of course, Benghazi. One of the things that strikes me, and this is what I rail about all the time, Chris, on my program, is where's the media in all this? It's crickets chirping. And the Benghazi Gate, hearings, Hillary Clinton, nothing's ever called a scandal by the media. Congress oversight on any matter, I mean, it's absolutely unfair, ridiculous coverage. It's not balanced. I mean, I think it's time to really take a serious look at that. Do you agree?
Well, it's clearly not balanced. These emails that came out from the IRS showing the mindset of Lois Lerner, for example. I don't want to talk too much code here, but I mean, this was in the news this past week, and okay, well, that was not covered. And I assure you, I don't read many newspapers, but I've read enough to know if the shoe were on the other foot and a conservative employee of the Energy Department was calling liberal activists the same thing the IRS was calling, okay, yes, it would lead the news every day until I'm dead. They would never let go of it. It'd be like my dog with a sock. And somehow this isn't of interest, even though it's the most feared, rightly feared, powerful agency in the U.S. government, the IRS, that's been clearly taken over, but it's being abused. Well, I don't know what to tell you, except that don't put your faith in journalists. There are some out there who will cover this. It is the minority. You're going to have to put not thy faith in judges or politicians either, but you have to try all of it and hope for the best, because we've got a lot more people out there like you, reaching a lot more people like your listeners, who will get up and come out and take to the streets and say, no, this is not how it's going to be. And only then, by the way, until things are like 2009 and 2010, when suddenly people paid attention, my boss actually wants me to do what I've been hired to do we make any progress? And so don't always think someone's taking care of this. This is your listener's job. We're just we're doing everything we can, but you've got to support groups, you've got to write letters, you've got to be active as you can be.
Well, you've been so active, and I mean, just the work you've done is incredible. And you're even a criminal. I mean, the subtitle of your book is Confessions of a Freedom of Information Criminal. Tell my listeners how you became a criminal, Chris.
We ultimately had to sue the University of Virginia and University of Arizona. We will have to sue other schools because academics are protecting the climate establishment, which, again, is one of the biggest gravy trains they've seen in a long time, too. So we filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the University of Virginia for certain Michael Mann emails relating to the hockey stick. And they told us, well, after an exhaustive search, there are no records. And then the Attorney General of the state said, I'd like to see those. And oh, you mean these? Yeah, okay. I just found them under the sofa cushion. They're right here. Now that a law enforcement officer is asking me, I'll give a different story.
Oh.
So we sued, and Lisa Jackson, the administrator of EPA, gave a speech at, of all places, Berkeley Law School, California, Berkeley, and called, she said, this Freedom of Information Act request is criminal. Well, that reflects, I'll be charitable, some ignorance about what is criminal and what is set forth in statute for things, vehicles for taxpayers to find out what's going on, or what our Supreme Court once said is what your government is up to. And so we were simply seeking records owned by the taxpayer, and she called us criminal, which, look, I've got to tell you, these are senior government officials calling taxpayers who simply want public records or to try to find records that are on their face public and let the state prove to a court they aren't.
And how dare you ask a question, Chris? I mean, it's ironic that here's standing there at the Berkeley Law podium to give a speech in which she's saying your Freedom of Information Act request is criminal, only be later exposed as creating a false identity. I mean, that's the irony of all.
Yeah. At a law school, this is like a clue. Okay, Miss Martha, I'll take Administrator Jackson at a law school. Okay, while she's breaking the law, calling other people criminals for exercising rights set forth in statute when Congress said, here you go, use this. Shame seems to have taken a vacation in Washington. It's on a milk carton with these people, but look, we're trying, and all I can say is my parting message is always, please don't think this is being taken care of. Please don't think that small contributions don't help. Please don't think that your one letter to your member or a couple of phone calls following up don't make a difference. They do. This is not just going to take care of itself. Obviously, from our conversation and everything else we all know, you're dealing with very committed people who, as they've said, they want to jail people who disagree with them. And the only reason we know that is they say it with very disturbing frequency.
Absolutely. Well, another case you got into involves Jim Messina, who is Deputy White House Chief of Staff, the fixer. Tell what happened here with him.
Well, we found out what we have now found is there's an epidemic in the Obama administration and probably elsewhere of moving correspondence that by coincidence, a lot of coincidences, you don't want to be preserved for the record, let's say under the Federal Records Act or released under the Freedom of Information Act. Oddly, a lot of that correspondence is finding its way to Gmail or AOL. And, for example, the Solyndra program here was administered on 14 separate private email accounts. That's how your billions are being distributed to political cronies. Well, in the White House, this advisor to the president, the guy known as his fixer, Jim Messina, he struck a deal, and I know this, the Wall Street Journal editorialized about this but didn't see the actual email address. I saw the raw email itself. In striking his deal with drug companies to get them to spend the money to lobby for Obamacare, he moved over to AOL to strike his deal with them where, okay, you pay, I forget the figure, $20 million, whatever, for this, and you get this sweet deal in the law as we've agreed. And that's the kind of thing, while close presidential advisors generally are exempt from the Freedom of Information Act, their correspondence is still retained for history under the Federal Records Act. Well, sensitive things like the Solyndra cronyism are increasingly finding their way onto private email accounts. And this is, like I say, this is not a rarity now. It was at the time, but it goes all the way up to these really sleazy-looking things, which is the kind of thing you would want to move off to a private email account, like striking a deal with drug companies to lobby for your law, in which you wet their beak. Well, and Solyndra, I keep finding more and more of this. And the problem with that is when somebody sends an oversight request from Congress or a discovery request in litigation to the agency or a Freedom of Information Act request, these people aren't searching those accounts. And I detail in the book various ways in which we found this out, but you're asking the same person who decided in the first place to not use the account the law requires him to use to then decide what you might want to see. Well, they keep saying, well, I'm not going to search my AOL because they can't possibly be asking for that because they don't know about it. Okay, that's what you should expect when you're leaving it up to the person who decided to use AOL in the first place.
It is absolutely unbelievable. I mean, and you really do see these, it's very deliberate and very elaborate mechanisms to really hide what's really going on, though, isn't it, here?
I'll tell you, at NASA, somebody we've talked about, the guy who replaced Jim Hansen, this may have been the most elaborate scheme we found yet. So the taxpayer buys a computer with a grant through the National Science Foundation for this guy. He then brings that computer into his office at NASA, but he says it's a private computer. You see, yes, the taxpayer bought it, but it's not owned by the taxpayer. And he uses that computer to access his NASA emails where he's working as an activist for the global warming movement. And he has set up his account, and this is all detailed in their affidavits, in pleadings in District Court, Washington Federal Court. Their excuse for not giving us the emails was they set up a very elaborate system whereby he would bring in this private computer to access his NASA emails, and accessing it from a non-NASA computer would destroy NASA's copy on its spool on the computer, leaving the only copy on his private computer sitting in the NASA office, all of which is paid for by us, but which he refuses us access to, claiming it's private. That's pretty elaborate. It's kind of like creating a false identity, but even more so. Why are you doing this if it's not, as the cynic might suggest, to get around what you agreed to as a condition of your sweet job with the taxpayer, which is transparency? Those aren't your records, they're ours. I suggest that all of these things we've been discussing are the result or the product of people deciding that it would be in their interest, forget what the requirements are, it's in their interest to do these things, private false identities, private email accounts, bringing in privately owned computers, and destroying the government's copy on its spool, using texting instead of emailing and destroying every one of those, and so on. Okay, I think you have to be pretty naive to believe that this remarkable pattern is not designed to keep you in the dark when the law says you're to be in the know.
Well, and the common thread throughout all of this, I think, is probably, I mean, obviously they don't want to disclose things that are happening. There's, no discussions here, folks, no activities. We don't conduct anything nefarious on every front. But the law is clear. You're a lawyer and performing official business on private resources. That doesn't make it any less official, does it?
No, it doesn't. And their argument is generally, well, you see, there's nothing there, so I destroyed it. That's actually the excuse we got for the EPA administrator affirmatively destroying every single one of her thousands of text messages. What I had proved on Friday with this document production under a lawsuit was these text messages, which is just an alternative to email, just like a private account is an alternative to a government account, they are preserved. If you don't have the AOL that you sent or received on an account that you chose to use despite the rules, that doesn't mean that it wasn't a record. It just means you destroyed a record. Right. If you don't have these text messages, it means you destroyed them. And her excuse was, again, this is their excuse, like that elaborate NASA excuse I just described. The excuse was, well, it wasn't anything, so I destroyed it. No one can ever check. You see the brilliance in that? Well, I destroyed it because there was nothing there. How do you know? Because I destroyed it, but there's nothing there. That's why I destroyed it. But why would you destroy it if there's nothing there? Did you know that you don't, no one does. I only got them on Friday, but all the text messages I did get from EPA, all of them were nothing there. They were all, hey, I just got on Amtrak. Would you book a flight for me? Nothing substantive was preserved. Everything substantive was destroyed, and all the ones that you could reasonably characterize as, oh, it was nothing, there was nothing there, are the only ones they still have. I'm starting to not believe this defense that, well, I destroyed it because there was nothing there.
Well, I mean, but the law's being broken left, right, and center here. You know, Justice Department won't touch it. House ICE Committee has oversight. Yeah, the media, you know, maybe the conservative media and maybe some blog sphere, but essentially is ignoring it. Again, crickets chirping. So what can happen? I mean, how can we my listeners are an incredible audience, and how can they, though, who feel outraged about these kind of things that are happening, hope for some kind of satisfactory conclusion to all this, Chris?
Well, in a way, and I won't get into the details, but if Cloward and Piven rings a bell, then it rings a bell. You can overwhelm their system by everybody doing what, for example, the last two chapters in The Liberal War on Transparency are a how-to on FOIA, and it applies across state laws, the U.S. federal law, the German law. The basic principles apply, but the precedents are there. Just ask questions, because you know what? If a lot of you do, they're not going to be able to hide it all because they can't keep up with it. And then press your rights and file your appeal. And what happens is you will force errors, but not unless a lot of you get involved. Because right now there's very little accountability. But if enough of you do this, then things will come out because they simply cannot keep up with an active public. And when they don't keep up, they waive rights. If they don't respond in 20 days, okay, they can't charge you. If they don't do this, then they can't do this. And you're going to lead them into failures because they're not all that interested in cooperating, but the problem is they sacrifice some rights, defenses against you. So a lot of people start asking questions. Somebody out there is going to get something good because they farm a lot of it out, and the political appointees can only demand to see so many of these. A lot of it goes to contractors if they get overwhelmed. Then when these things come out, at least in the U.S., we have a law. It's Title 18, 2071, destruction, removal, or mutilation of federal records. We're going to find people who are facing up to 3 years for doing the wrong thing. And I'm sorry, but at some point somebody's going to have to pay because we found this to be deliberate, systemic, and systematic. They're doing it on purpose. There's no way all the things we've discussed aren't on purpose. It's an awful lot of unrelated accidents being committed by up to and including the White House, as even the New York Times and Mother Jones covered once. They're using private email accounts to set up meetings off campus and so on. Ask the questions, ask for the records, make it a tight request, ping them and tell them you waived your rights after 20 days and so on, and they're going to be turning over records to you. And ultimately, there are a few of us public interest law firms out there to take these cases and say, now we've got an issue, okay? You've got destruction of records. It's largely left to Eric Holder, but pause, wait for laughter, or deep, deep sobbing. But at some point, it's not all going to be up to Eric Holder. And at some point, look, exemplars I've gotten have led Mark Levin and Landmark Legal to pursue their own lawsuits.
Because Mark Levin actually went after those emails, did he not?
Well, he got the first Carol Browner, that case. It's a beautiful thing. The Carol Browner case, she had her hard drive destroyed on her last day of work. It was clearly, it was what it was, the last day of work. She suddenly had it reformatted when she had never indicated she knew what that meant and so on. The FBI found it. Turns out I found out she had a secondary account. Nobody had ever done it. She had it set on auto-delete. We know who we're dealing with. Well, since then, Marcus, they've continued on some cases. And he took some exemplars I found, like in the Richard Windsor case, of private email use, and they got their judge to say, tell you what, I'm going to allow discovery. And you can go search these accounts or have these people search them, but at least supervise it and so on. And so when we get these emails, just like when your listeners get them, if they do this and you follow up, there are going to be others out there who will run with the ball further if they have the skill set, the resources, whatever. It's a team effort. And so things I've extracted have led to Mark and his group running further with, and things Mark extracted have led to me running further with. And people, I know about Richard Windsor. I know about other email accounts at EPA. I know about secondary accounts that only had 100 emails on them. I know about all sorts of things because people in the agency are contacting me. And there are a lot of good people there, even if it's largely a self-selecting universe of activists. And there are people who are disgusted with what's going on. And the more you find, the more it's going to prompt people to come out and say, here, what? You should know this. That's how I know about Richard Windsor. It's how I know about a lot of things.
Well, you're right. You nailed it. We've got very systemic problems that do need to be fixed, and they're not getting fixed. I mean, the Department of Justice should be clean in house here, but they have literally less than no interest. And, I mean, I guess so my question would be, is impeachment a plausible conclusion to this thing? Because, I mean, since the Justice Department, they're not going to do anything clearly.
Well, it's there, dereliction of duty and malfeasance. This is beyond misfeasance. Yeah, it's possible, but no, it's not plausible. I think what you're going to do is have people do what they can. Ultimately, these chickens come home to roost.
Yeah.
Ultimately, it may be that the politicians' bosses demand you have to stop the corruption, and to do that, you're going to have to remove some people. But these are political solutions. They're put in our system as political solutions. During the impeachment of Bill Clinton, they made a mistake charging him with a criminal count of impeachment instead of lying was enough for Nixon, but they said perjury. And so on. It's a political act, and if there's no political will, then no, it's not plausible. But look, as you can tell, I'm mildly exercised about this because it's so outrageous what's going on and it's so widespread. I have a feeling if an awful lot more people had enough, that there'd be the political will to do something, because as I've seen, people have left EPA after we have exposed them. Other people will leave after you expose them. Other people, Eric Holder needs a lot of exposing before he leaves. But the problem is at the top, it's also all the way down to the bottom. So do what you can and see what happens.
Where is the role of academia in all this? I mean, you get into that quite a bit in your book. And, I mean, how are they tied in with these kind of issues, too, the public-funded academia? Right.
They are, I haven't counted the legs of the stool, but they're certainly one of them, to this sort of the state complex. Okay, you've got activist groups. This week, a report was issued by the Senate Environment Committee minority, and it detailed how some billionaires are underwriting groups, activist pressure groups, even to the point that private groups were then, activist groups, underwriting positions in government, in the White House. Now, I've got one of my younger researchers looking into this, how this is possibly legal. But it shows that they know the role of foundations. And what this report, it's on the Senate EPW, Environment Public Works webpage, shows you is that the role of committed, wealthy people like Maurice Strong and others, and their pressure groups that they underwrite to help advance the cause of robbing Peter Evermore to pay Paul being the collective they. They include academia, just like pressure groups, which take an enormous amount of Peter's money every year. So do academia. Now, they use academia like they use pressure groups to argue for more government, to argue for more money for academia, to argue for more money for pressure groups. They're no different. Academics are a very vested interest in this, just like these pressure groups. And they're also subject to, the publicly funded ones are subject to state freedom of information laws. There's more to come in our various litigations. We had just this week the University of Arizona's response to our lawsuit for Climategate-related emails filed, and I've never seen anything like it. This is from a university, which, yes, is the opposite of diversity, horrified that bad people, us, would dare to exercise their rights under the law against them.
Right.
This is for other people. And the pleading is purely about bad people, Your Honor. Bad people want these documents. You can't have bad people have them. We were in court in the University of Virginia case where Michael Mann's lawyer went on and on for about 45 minutes, about 35 of it pure ad hominem, Bilderberg stuff. And at the end, the judge, only because he said this is good, enough is enough is enough, the judge said, let me ask you something. Okay, I understand everybody has to say this now. The other guys are really bad people, but does this change at all how the law is implemented? And Mann's lawyer said, well, no, Your Honor, I think the law is very clear. And he said, then why are you arguing this to me? It was a great moment. The case ended up wrong, and people, whether or not you think the university is being protected is up to you, but the judge he said, why? And he did it again at the next hearing. He was nodding him off, don't go there. And he twice said, why are you arguing this to me? It's purely ad hominem. Well, the University of Arizona's pleading filed this week was nothing but, it's just like the stuff against Mark Stein. These are bad people. You can't let these bad people have equal treatment under the law. And so that's who academia is. These pleadings in court, that's who they are. We faced it with Virginia, we faced it with Arizona, and we're facing it in other states. This is pretty typical. They have a gravy train. They're riding it. We're paying for it. They don't like the fact that our questions might upset it. And, whatever the courts are going to do, the courts are going to do. Whatever the public and taxpayers and the lawmakers are going to do, they're going to do if they feel these universities are being coddled and protected. But the public needs to know, and so we have to try. And the universities are affirming who they are in this behavior. They don't want to be scrutinized, as was a condition of taking this money, any more than any of the other people we found hiding what they're up to. And that's because an awful lot of them are fully vested participants in this sort of big government enterprise it's kind of like in Europe, the thing that bothers a lot of people is the call for ever closer union. Ever larger abandonment of sovereignty is one way to translate ever closer union. You're less and less France, you're less and less the UK every year. Well, this is ever more state, and they've fully thrown in on this, so it's okay for us to start asking questions. That's the law. They take our money, and they don't like it.
Well, I guess the sad part to me is, when I think about all this so-called human-caused global warming, a lot of people think they call it a hoax, but I think that's incorrect. A hoax is defined as maybe even a humorous or malicious deception, but there's nothing humorous to me about the corruption of climate science to, further these political agendas, and it's always very benevolent, guised as malevolent, isn't it? Because it's always for the greater good. It's like the precautionary principle. Well, there's really no proof, but we better get on it. Who would see that this creature we would only wish was mythical, the unsufferable, arrogant, eye-rolling, prosperity rotund Mr. Huckster Al Gore lecturing us on the need to dismantle capitalism for the sake of the planet while living in a 10,000-square-foot mansion, amassing an enormous fortune, and don't get me started on Al Jazeera, a true act of patriotism, Chris. But, leaving the carbon footprint of a million farting and frequent flying abominable snowmen, it's just crazy when the media absolutely propagates this stuff, too. It's just the whole thing, when you step back and take a macro view, do you ever just absolutely shake your head in all this?
Constantly, and I used to ask someone in jest, is it that he doesn't believe a word he says, or he just thinks he's different, and this is about those other people they think of and mean when they say people. And I did a TV show recently. It was Hannity. At the very end, there's some foil he likes to bring on and then let me sit there and occasionally say something. It's some green activist. And he said at the end, what about Al Gore and his all of these mansions and jet setting and so on? And the guy, the counterpart, I forget his name, said, he said, he has to do this. It's different. He needs to do this to spread the word. And I immediately recalled something I had heard in the sermon recently about pious fictions. Uh-huh. It's his pious fictions. He's saying, I can run around doing what I say destroys the world when you do it. Just like I can run around lecturing those wretched brown people to stop having babies as he does. He goes to Africa and starts lecturing them, how dare you have kids, as he's surrounded by four blonde-haired children, which are somehow completely different, who live a lifestyle far more energy-consuming and carbon-intensive. As he points out in his book, the average child born into the Western world will have a greater carbon footprint than the one born into the developing world. Meanwhile, he has 4 children and runs to the developing world and tells them to stop having children. Well, he runs around telling us to stop flying and so on. He flies around telling us to stop flying. His acolyte said, well, it's different for him. It's evil when you do it, but it's different for him because he has to spread the word. These are pious fictions. They are remarkable hypocrites. But I also think he doesn't – I'm not as convinced on this. He's plainly, breathtakingly hypocritical, him and his. Whether they believe any of it, I don't know. I really don't.
Well, you have to almost hand it to him. There's probably a good reason he got the award that he did, because it is purely, absolutely make-believe land of fairy tale, really, to get a Academy Award. And I think it's you have to really wonder with these guys, really, because they're pagan Earth goddess Gaia 11 occultist Al Gore always does come out with saying we've got to drastically respond. And it almost reminds me what you just said about who do we start with first. It's like Prince Philip saying, I wish I could come back as, if I was ever reincarnated, I'd come back as a deadly virus to wipe out the human population. I mean, who gets away with these sickening phrases? There's many of them. Kissinger, Rockefeller, you name it. They have these ridiculous things. And then Ted Turner he's churning out, we've got too many people using too much stuff and we've got to act now.
Let me ask you, being an environmentalist means never having to say you're sorry. And that goes from Rachel Carson and the wreckage and the body count she left behind, all of them.
Yeah.
It's clear. But I had the proper intentions. Don't look at the body count. Don't even look. What do you expect from the crowd who refuses to ask, will it work? And always tries to. Everything's about, well, this would feel great, and this sounds wonderful. The idea of will it work? Is it a disaster there? Why do you stop telling us to look to Spain as your economic model? Where did that speech go? The policies didn't change. The speech changed. He just dropped the speech. Good heavens, that means they know. And you can't – I think they should say they're sorry then, because you know. So being an environmentalist means never having to say you're sorry. It's all about intentions.
Well, you're right. This echo chamber always reverberates out the rhetoric. Look to Europe, doesn't it?
Yeah, stop looking to Europe.
Well, I think one of the things as we wrap up the show, Chris, and again, people, you need to go and get these books. And if you don't have Red Hot Lies, it's such a good book. Power Grab is excellent. Every book that you've written is just so good. And again, I'd really like you to just wrap up here, Chris, by telling people how they can get involved and help out, and what can people do to get active here? Because it's one thing to say you're a keyboard commando or an armchair patriot, but what is it that people in our listening audience, we have such a robust audience, I'd like you to tell them what they can do, because I know people are just fed up with all the lies that are churned out, and I think sometimes people think, you can't fight City Hall, but you've proven that wrong.
Well, sometimes, but only by trying, and you're going to have to try a lot, and start with City Hall. Actually, before that, start with the schools. Start with the local school board. Remember when they went from Kyoto to this ICLEI, this Agenda 21, was simply because, in part they recognized the problems that they ran into with a global treaty seeking to ration energy among a few countries and transfer wealth from them through just a really, really overreach. And also as part of a pincer movement. They went local, and that was this ICLEI Agenda 21 thing. You do both, but also they emphasized the ICLEI after they saw the problems that an aware public – remember, you stopped, not in Canada, but in the U.S., you who stood up stopped Kyoto. You did. Remember, he and Obama didn't get card check and cap and trade. Now, yes, he's going through the administrative route because of you getting up, and we'll fight that one. But it matters, and it matters in the schools, at the school board, it matters at City Hall, it matters at the County Planning Commission, all of the ICLEI Agenda 21 stuff. My county withdrew, and now a bunch have. We were among the first, certainly 8, simply by going to the meetings and reading the ICLEI document, the Agenda 21 documents, and actually were heckled the Jefferson-area Tea Party was heckled saying, yeah, conspiracy theorists, haha, these things you're saying. And then they said, look, I'm reading your document, and so on. So get involved. Don't think it doesn't matter.
Well, and I think it's important. People have to understand, I mean, Agenda 21 is thrown around a lot, but they have to remember this calls for a profound reorientation of human activity. I mean, that's what I call hell on earth. When you look at the smart grid, the smart technologies, and, you got the different directors of the ABC alphabet soup company saying, yeah, we're going to spy on you through your smart appliances. I mean, this is absolutely, George Orwell would roll in his grave, I think.
Well, he wrote 1984 because he experienced the reality of his prior convictions in Spain. And people abuse power, and they're very adaptive. And all of the things we have been discussing are about that. And, yes, you'll find when they say, but even business supports it, that's a little – you got that backward. Of course business supports it. When you rob Peter to pay Paul, you've got Paul's enthusiastic support. Enron started the whole global warming industry. I was there. Sometimes you'd be surprised, and so on. So all I'm saying is start with the big ones, the most clear and present threats.
I chuckled so much when Al Gore was in the hearings and he said, Ken Lay, never heard of him. I mean, basically, that's basically who's Ken. Unbelievable. But like you said, absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? Well, Chris, I'd like you to give out your website. It's also linked, of course. People can go to weekendvigilante.com. You can see Chris's bio, and his website is linked there. But give it out for the listeners. ChrisHornerOnline.com is a good place to start, and CEI.org. There are various ones, eelegal.org, and we'll stop there. But Chris Horner Online is a great place to start. And how can people support your work? I'm really encouraging my audience members to really get behind you, donate, tell people how they can do that. Okay, small checks, big checks. We depend upon the kindness of strangers. eelegal.org, you can support us there, and also the Free Market Environmental Law Clinic or CEI. You support any of those three groups, and you're supporting what we do. Competitive Enterprise Institute, with whatever you could do, it will add up, just like those letters and phone calls. Free Market Environmental Law Clinic and eelegal.org. We're separate entities, but we're all doing similar work, and we all need support because this stuff doesn't just happen. Well, absolutely, and I guarantee you that my audience will be stepping up to the plate. Absolutely amazing work that you've done, Chris, and I really want to commend you because these things take years. And I don't know where things are at with the most latest affidavits, but, let's face it, this takes a lot of work, does it not? Yes, it does, and we've been fortunate I've hired a few young lawyers to help us out here. We're growing, but the problem is they now want to be paid. So I got a veal pen. You can only do the internship so long, right? That's right. But I said we bought a nice veal pen, but they're not getting satisfied with that. So. Well, Chris, again, I want to thank you for coming on the program. Folks, get his books. Go to the website. It's earmarked on weekendvigilante.com. Thank you so much. Thank you, Sheila, very much. And welcome back to the Weekend Report with the Weekend Vigilante and Hagmanns for August 2nd, 2014. If you're just joining us, our theme tonight is climate corruption. We have the amazing Christopher Horner. My next guest is one of my favorite people on the planet, Dr. Timothy Ball, who was my co-host for years. He's the author of The Deliberate Corruption of Climate Science and renowned climatologist with a long list of very impressive credentials, including speaking worldwide on the corruption of climate science for a political agenda, and one of many who exposed Climategate. And let me tell you, this man has taken on corruption, but at an enormous cost to him and his family. Let me tell you, this is an incredibly brave and brilliant man, yet so humble, who, despite being sued, harassed, sent death threats, put his entire family life savings on the line to fight frivolous lawsuits against those unscrupulous charlatans who tried to silence him. He refuses to cower to the globalist thugs, and I'd love to welcome him to the program, Dr. Timothy Ball. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Sheila, and it's so great to work with you, and I really enjoyed that session with Chris Horner. That was, it's just disturbing, but it's got to be heard. It's just got to be heard.
Well, he actually said off air that he is a big fan of yours, too. So just incredible. You're just an incredible group. You actually just went to a climate conference in Las Vegas, and you got to hobnob with Lord Monkton. How was that experience?
Well, the Heartland Institute in Chicago, they were the first people in the world to organize an international conference of people that were presenting the other side of the climate and global warming issue. Governments and the mainstream media, of course, have totally pushed one side of the issue. And so the Heartland, their first conference was in New York, and I had the privilege of being a keynote speaker on a platform with Fred Singer, who has actually been fighting this issue longer than I have, and so that was a great privilege. But what was interesting was the overall keynote speaker was Václav Klaus, the Czech Republic president.
Right.
And his opening remark in his keynote address was, "We've just gone through 70 years of communism. Why the hell would you want to go back to that?" And, of course, the place just erupted. My opening comment was, I've waited 40 years for this day, and here it is. And to have an international conference of that scale was really something. Since then, of course, Heartland have had 9 conferences. The one in Las Vegas that you referred to was the 9th conference. I also spoke at the 6th conference in Washington, so this is my 3rd contribution, and it's tremendously invigorating and reassuring, because when you work on your own and you almost feel like you're a complete voice in the wilderness, and then you're isolated. So that everybody that you meet asks you questions. Like, for example, I can't appear on a radio program or a media interview where the first question is, how are you qualified to talk about this? And so you really start to doubt yourself, and that's why these conferences are so important. It's the original idea of a sabbatical, that you get out of your own little university and get a chance to go and meet with other people working in the same areas. It is so important. In fact, by the way,
you just said, how are you qualified? I got to jump in there, because one of the things that I like about, I think is really, I appreciate about you, Tim, is you have the uncanny ability to make a very complex data and information very easily palatable for most common people, yet you're an outstanding and well-respected and renowned doctor of the hardest, most complicated subject in the world, in my opinion. You're very qualified to talk about climate, yet how does some buffoon, like we just heard Al Gore there in that clip, how can he spew out complete nonsense? When did he become a top climatologist?
Well, of course, that's one of the signs that people should look at. The fact that nobody ever asks him about his qualifications, and of course, one of the things, and unfortunately, it's a weakness in the United States, from my point of view, that they tend to imbue people that hold high office, such as the president or the vice president, with the height of the position. And so that they assume that because you've become vice president, that you're worthy of that office. And you've got to separate the person from the office. You quoted Lord Acton, who was the guy that actually said power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. The second sentence that followed that was, and most great people are bad people. But he also said that you must not imbue the person in the office with the authority of the office. And, of course, that's what happens with Al Gore. But back to your comment about the fact that I'm qualified but also have a God-given ability to explain complex things in ways that people can understand, those are the two things, of course, that made me so vulnerable to attack. Because they couldn't say I wasn't qualified, and they knew that if I could talk to an audience, I could explain what they were doing.
Well,
and so,
you're dangerous.
Exactly.
You know why? Because you lose people when things are too sciencey, and as Voltaire says, everything has its time. Your book, in essence, was really timely this year when it came out, The Deliberate Corruption of Climate Science, and folks can go to weekendvigilante.com and click on the link there. But what's interesting is most people, they don't know anything about weather or climate or science. And when things are too scientific, you do lose people, in that sciencey complexity. So but how he's even qualified, again, like the people like Pachuri, the bearded railway engineer that's head of the IPCC, you've got a gynecologist in there. I mean, these people are giving us pointers on how we're pretty much killing the planet. But here's the issue. How does he get to talk about that, let alone make a sci-fi children-scaring movie, a movie, I might add, for folks that don't know this, that was ruled by a judge to have over 9 major errors. It was alarmism. It was touted as alarmism by the judge. It was exaggerated. And he said, and I quote this from the judge, he said, it shouldn't be shown to children. And Al Gore's sci-fi movie, That Inconvenient Truth, is a brilliant piece of propaganda, isn't it?
Yep. Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I don't know if you know the name Lena Riefenstahl.
Was she the one that did the propaganda film with Hitler?
Yeah, she died at 92 just a couple of years ago, and of course denied that. She said, "Oh no, my movies are not propaganda." Well, of course Al Gore tells you the same thing, but they're both exactly in the same thing. But there's an interesting idea that you've raised in your questions here, Sheila, and that is, well, first of all, we're into the era of professional politicians. Right? These are people who they start at the school board level and they work their way up. That's why I thought that Chris Horner's comment about go and tackle your school board, because that's where this is all originating from, and so that's where these people start their careers. You know the old comment about those that can do and those that can't teach. Well, I've elaborated on that because it applies to people like Al Gore, is those that can do and those that can't teach. Those that can't do either of those administrate, and then those that can't administrate become union leaders or politicians. And, of course, that's the story with Gore. Gore totally failed at everything that he did. I mean, you can go and listen to the satirical tapes that the guy on the Rush Limbaugh show has put out. I've forgotten his name. But this is, they say, well, you failed at divinity school. You dropped out of divinity school, And say, well, no, I didn't. But he did. And so what you've got now are these professional politicians, and they look for a vehicle to push their career. And, of course, one of the things that is they pick up on what are emotional issues of the day. It could be as it was with the prohibition. The problems of alcoholism and so on. I'm fighting this and I'm doing this and I'm doing that. And so people latch on to these things not because they want to resolve them or even understand them, but they use them as a vehicle for their own personal career.
Right.
And environmentalism. I mean, I now on my website or whenever I put out my
your blog.
resume, I list myself as an environmentalist. And of course, well, everybody can do that. We're all environmentalists. And yet you watch television, and here comes somebody on there, underneath it says environmentalist. Well, where did they get that title? And the answer is, of course, that everybody's an environmentalist, but these guys say, no, you're not, because only I care. Only I'm out there talking about it. And so they grab the microphone and say, I'm an environmentalist, I care about the planet, therefore you've got to listen to me, because I am now a self-declared expert. That's how they get away with not being challenged. Because the minute somebody says those things, the first question should be, well, where did you get your qualifications? And I'll give you an example, Sheila. I was summoned to appear before the Canadian Parliamentary Committee on the ozone issue. And there were three of us, three scientists, and we collectively had about 120 years of teaching and researching on ozone environmental issues. There were 5 people representing Friends of the Earth. And just think of the arrogance of that title. The Friends of the Earth title says, if you're not in our group, you're not a friend of the Earth. And yet I spoke to them all afterwards, and yet they all got the same amount of time as the 3 scientists, and not one of them had ever done a university course on anything to do with environment. But because they were in this group, and that was the in thing that, oh yeah, these people really care, they get all the credibility and they get all of the media attention, and unfortunately they get the political attention too, because the politicians want to appear green. And I think that phrase, two phrases that applies to it. One is the cloak of green, that so many of these people, like politicians, put on the cloak of green, but underneath is a totally red agenda. And
like
the other
watermelons,
term is,
right?
Well, yeah, and of course, James Delingpole wrote the book Watermelon, analyzing these people. And the Cloak of Green book by Elaine Dewar, she wanted to write a book praising Canadian environmentalists who had all kinds of credibility with the media and access to the media, and she wanted to write a book in praise of them, but the more she investigated them and spoke with them and studied what they were doing, she discovered they were more corrupt, more hypocritical, as Chris Horner said, and making more money than a lot of the people that they were attacking.
Well, what's interesting about the Cloak of Green is she actually learned that Maurice Strong kind of, and for people that don't know, he's really kind of the progenitor of the environmental movement. He kind of breezed into the Big Apple in the 70s and took up a ready-made job with Rockefeller. Fast forward to the 92 Rio Summit. He was in a BBC interview back in 72, Tim, and he was already talking about the word sustainability and overpopulation. But it's interesting because the Cloak of Green, he was touted as saying he was a socialist at heart but a capitalist in business. How does that one make sense?
Well, of course it doesn't. And that shows you the contradictory thinking. And by the way, that whole idea of completely conflicting philosophies occurs all over the place. I shouldn't use a Canadian example for a lot of the American audience, but for years you had a province, which is equivalent to a state, like Saskatchewan, which voted conservative at the federal level, but voted socialist at the provincial level. And they say, well, how can they entertain such different philosophies in the same voter? But of course, it was that they were responding to the regional differences that occur. Well, this is what goes on with the environmentalists. You say, well, okay, do you believe in Darwin? Oh, yeah. Well, then Darwin's survival of the fittest, isn't he? Aren't humans the fittest of all the animals? Therefore, what we're doing is absolutely right and fits the Darwinian pattern. Oh, no, that's wrong. Well, they want it both ways.
You want it both ways, and it's the same phrases like I said to Chris. I mean, when Maurice Strong says we want to deindustrialize the United States, what part of that don't people get? The zero growth in the late 60s, population control, really the precursor to what we're seeing now, infrastructure being gutted and sent overseas today, because after all, isn't it our job to do that, deindustrialize the United States? Well, here's the problem with all this, Tim. It's not us saying, it's not Tim and Sheila and Chris Horner and Doug Hagmann and Joe. It's these guys saying these phrases like Prince Philip wanting to come back as a killer virus to wipe out the population. Why don't we start with you, Prince Philip? How about
exactly.
That? But the thing is, here's the question I have for you, Tim, and I think it's really good for us to tell our audience about this, and I touched base with this with Chris Horner. You and I had the distinct pleasure of having a little interesting debate with the fellow, Christopher Keating, the physics professor. He wanted to have a debate that if anybody can prove that man is actually, not causing global warming, which is so interesting. Again, if you can prove that our information from NASA is wrong, it's the insanity of it all. What was your experience like doing that debate with him? It was kind of quite interesting, wasn't it?
Well, of course, it was enormously frustrating because, of course, he simply wanted to score points. He wasn't there for a debate. He supposedly at that time was offering a $10,000 reward to anybody that would beat him in a debate or disprove it in a debate. But what did we get? Right off the top, he started qualifying that $10,000 bet. And then he started qualifying everything. So it's like, say, well, we're going to debate this, but let me change the rules before we start the debate. And then he did one of the things that is very common, and I saw this over the weekend with a couple of debates I was involved in. And in fact, I saw it in Las Vegas because Sonia Boehmer Christensen was on the panel with me, and Sonia is a socialist. And what's amazing about Sonia is she was born in East Germany under the communists, and yet she continues to support socialism, even though she's living now in the West. And of course, I realize that it's Ignatius Loyola thing: give me the child, and I'll give you the adult. But every single question that came up, and you give an answer, and then she'd wave her leftist hand and say, "Oh no, it's far more complex than that." And that's what Keating was doing. "Oh no, it's much more complex than that." No, it isn't. It's quite simple. You know, what you said is that if the CO2 increases, the temperature will go up. Well, sorry, that doesn't occur in any single record. Well, he just waved the hand. Oh, it's far more complex. You can't make simplistic statements like that. Well, go and look at the records. There, you can't find one that doesn't show that. So he was just really. And it's hard to, well, you shouldn't assign motive to somebody, but none of what he did was sincere. None of what he was doing held any water, and it was just, in fact, it's one of the frustrations, Sheila, that I have when people, first of all, if they're willing to debate, you can almost be sure they don't know the science, because if they know the science, they won't debate with you because they know they're going to lose. And so, but the other problem is if you have a debate with a scientist who does know the science, then the public listening wouldn't understand what we were talking about anyway. If you have a debate with a political person like Al Gore, and you noticed in that brief clip that you played where the guy started quoting the science back at him, and he just mumbled and fumbled and did the wave the hand. Oh well, it's the appeal to a higher authority. Oh, the IPCC said it, therefore it must be true. But do you understand what they're saying, Al? Oh no, but that doesn't matter. and so this is the problem. It's almost impossible to have a meaningful debate that the majority of the public or the listeners can understand. That's the challenge. Now, of course, within that are the seeds of what they've exploited. Because my paper, my presentation at Las Vegas was that only less than 20% of the population, and this has been shown for many countries, and I presented graphs showing it, less than 20% are comfortable or even understand basic science. 80% of the population are art students. And they not only don't understand science, but are proud of the fact that they can't crunch numbers. And you see that in the derogatory term of, oh, number crunchers, oh, they're nerds. And so that lack of understanding of science or even willingness to understand science, that's been exploited by these scientists like Keating to say, oh, well, as he said, oh, well, the CO2 into the ocean, it's the biggest factor and all the rest of it. Well, he knows that nobody can challenge him on that other than somebody like me. And the minute I challenge him on it, of course, right away, oh, well, you're just one person and 97% disagree and so on. So all of these things are exploited. And by the way, in my presentation at Las Vegas, Yale University had a questionnaire about climate and about global warming, about climate science and global warming amongst the public. They found that 70%, they graded them, A, B, C, D, F, like a high school grading system. 70% were in the D's and F's in their surveys. Wow. So what they did was, and they actually put this into their report, they said, well, it's obvious the questions were too difficult. So then they did what all students are aware of and dread, is they applied the curve to the results. Well, you know how that's done in schools, applying a curve to get the kind of distribution of results that you want, but doesn't reflect how successful or how bad your course has been. And so they curved the results, and they ended up with well over 50% doing well on the test.
Wow.
And
that's incredible.
Yeah, it is absolutely incredible. And yet they publish this stuff. And so,
speaking of curving information, the Xbox 360 computer models. I mean, it's amazing that when you really get into the nitty-gritty of this, that somebody like Michael Mann could come along with a subterfuge and, you know, pass it off as something that works when, like I said with Chris, you can feed in any kind of data to that algorithm, and every single time it'll come out with a hockey stick. It doesn't matter what you put in it. I mean, there is no way that a computer model can forecast these types of things. Explain that to people, Tim.
Well, of course, what happened with the hockey stick was that, and I think it's important to know, and this again speaks to this problem of specialization, special areas. I mean, statistics is one of those areas that is very specialized. And a guy by the name of Steve McIntyre, whose career involved identifying falsified statistics and falsified graphs of statistics, particularly in the stock market with mining claims. And, everybody knows the Bre-X claim, for example, where they presented all these graphs of how much gold there was and so on. Well, McIntyre was at a conference, and somebody put up this graph that was in the shape of a hockey stick. Nobody had to tell McIntyre where it came from. He didn't know that it was climate data or claiming to be climate data. He just knew that this was a completely falsely derived graph by looking at it. And, of course, that's the whole idea of specialists and specialization. Other people look at it, and as Gore very emphasized the thing where he got in the movie, he got on that forklift. You remember? He's going along this level. Oh, and then all of a sudden the forklift goes way up in the air. What the dramatic effect of that? Well, McIntyre knew that had been derived falsely. And he knew it had been derived by creating a formula that it didn't matter what numbers you put into the formula, it was going to give you that printout, that result. And of course, that was what was done. And so again, it's a speciality within a speciality.
Well, you can pay any pseudoscientist to pump out whatever message you want. I mean, any kind of – it hasn't warmed in 17 years. We do know that. And look at Al Gore said in that movie over 5 years ago that we'd all be pretty much, due to rising sea levels, we'd all be underwater. And, the lunacy is how hard they push this agenda, this propaganda to convince the masses are all the problem. Man is the problem here. And that's ludicrous. If man was causing global warming, then why, Tim, was the medieval warming hotter than now?
Well, and of course that was what they were trying to get rid of with the hockey stick. You see, people like myself and Richard Lindzen, when they with the medieval warm period, and this was another part of the disclosure of what they were doing. There was a graph in the first IPCC report in 1990, before climate science really got taken over for a political agenda. So the first report was reasonable. It said, here's all the limitations and here's all the problems. And there was a graph in there drawn by Hubert Lamb. It's graph 7C in the 1990 report, and it showed that, there's been warming since 1680, coming out of the Little Ice Age up to the present. But before that, the temperature had dropped from around 1100 AD down to 1680 from the medieval warm period. And in the leaked emails that we got from these people that did all this corruption, they're saying, well, where did this graph come from? We've got to get rid of it. And we've got to get rid of the medieval warm period. And now David Deming, who, by the way, his evidence is under oath before the U.S. Congress, where he said that he'd published an article which was misinterpreted by these corrupt scientists at East Anglia. They thought that he was on their side. And so one of them sent him an email which said, we've got to get rid of the medieval warm period. In other words, we've got to rewrite the history. We've got to get rid of that graph in the first IPCC report. So,
think about that for a sec, though. Rewriting our history for this kind. I mean, that is just that's frightening.
Well, of course, that's what socialist and totalitarian regimes do. I mean, look at what's going on in the Soviet Union right now. If you don't think Putin's just a continuation of the communist regime, I mean, they're writing out what was his name? The guy that Putin replaced, the alcoholic. I can't think of his name right now. That actually pushed or perestroika, got rid of Gorbachev. Well, they're writing him out of the history now. And Patrick Moore, who founded Greenpeace, and then quit because it was taken over the Marxists, they've now rewritten their history. Patrick Moore's been written out of the history of Greenpeace. This is what these people do. They rewrite the history to their own narrative. And so the rewriting of the climate history to show that today is warmer than it's ever been is perfectly normal in this left-wing totalitarian ideologies. And
it's also really right out of it's also right out of the Zilinsky playbook, isn't it? I mean, it's pure Marxism.
Yeah, the end justifies the means. The end justifies the means. And one of the things that amused me when you got Iran negotiating with Obama about reducing nuclear weapons, and of course Obama's sitting there with his Zilinsky strategy of the end justifies the means. In other words, if you have to lie, you lie, as he did with the if you want your health plan, you can keep it. And then on the other side of the table are the leaders of Iran who have a faith, Islam, that says in order to defend the faith, it's perfectly legal and acceptable to lie, to defend Islam. So you got liar facing liar. You want to talk about an Alice in Wonderland world, there it is, you know.
Well, and look at when the riots were in Egypt with Mubarak there, you know, democracy. They were marching on the street for democracy, right? What happened? It became a Muslim dictatorship.
Yep. Well, but you know what the riots were in Egypt? They were rioting because the price of food went through the roof. And why did the price of food go through the roof? Because the Greens in America had convinced the government to subsidize corn for biofuels. And the cost of corn went right up out of sight, and people were starving to death in Africa because of the cost of the food. And that caused food riots in Egypt. And by the way, when the food prices go through the roof, that's when the people get out on the streets and attack their leaders. And that's what was going on in Egypt. But, of course, it was very convenient for the Obama administration to say, oh, no, this is democracy, this is Arab Spring, and nothing to do with it. These are people that don't have democracy even at the family level. Even at the family level, they don't have democracy. So how can you argue that somehow there's democracy at any other level within the society?
It's just insane. And yet, well, Obama wouldn't know, Tim, because as we said in the clip, I had no knowledge. There was no knowledge here at the White House. There's never, he's the quintessential Flexian, isn't he, when it comes to pinning anything on him?
Yes, well, of course, that's what you do, is you set it up so that there are no way of tracing things back to you. But you then create an environment where the people that are working for you, who you've hired specifically and deliberately because they think like you do, they know what the message is. They know what's expected of them. I mean, Lois Lerner is a perfect example of it. And, of course, this is one of the things that both good and bad leaders get into trouble with. They lose control of their acolytes, of their followers. Now, Obama hasn't lost control of his at all. They're all doing exactly what they know he wants them to do. But it's the classic thing with the murder of Thomas à Becket, when the king said, won't anybody rid me of this troublesome priest? Well, these four stupid, thick knights are standing there and say, oh, the king wants us to get rid of the king. And they go down and slaughter the guy on the steps of the cathedral. And, of course, he becomes a martyr. And the king is saying, oh, no, I didn't mean it literally. But that's the problem with leadership. You either create, and you saw it with the Nixon White House, their Ehrlichman and Haldeman, they were reflecting the mentality and the aura that their leader had created. And now Obama has done it with far more precision, but by putting people in positions that he knows without even asking them that will follow his bidding. I mean, some of them have been pushed out of the White House because they've been exposed. Look, was it Jones? Wasn't it
Bill Jones?
Yeah, I've forgotten. He was in the White House, and Glenn Beck exposed him.
Yeah,
and he
Bill
was forced
Jones.
out. Yeah. And
then look at Obama's hand-picked science czar, John Holdren. Here's the guy that's supporting Population Bomb with Paul Ehrlich and writing incredible things about how we should be having one-child policies worldwide. And then the ironic thing, Tim, is these guys create a straw man, and it's like, I'll protect you from the straw man that you created. I mean, it's the ultimate.
Well, it's actually deviously clever circular argument. But just to give you an example of how these things function, and you can see this in the Chris, you talked about Agenda 21. And how that's all done. You see, the straw man that they create is that there's this threat to people and to the planet, and if we don't deal with it, and if you don't give me the authority to deal with it, it'll overrun us, and you'll be to blame. It'll be all your fault. Okay? Well, in his book, which he wrote with Paul Ehrlich, called Ecoscience, Population, Resources, Environment, John Holdren wrote, "Indeed, it has been concluded that compulsory population control laws, even including laws requiring compulsory abortion, could be, here's the kicker, could be sustained under the existing Constitution." All right, now here's the clever part of it. If the population crisis became sufficiently severe to endanger the society. All right, so that's the straw man. So who decides when the population crisis reaches that level of severity? Well, of course they do. They're the ones that decide when it reaches that level. And they say, oh, well, it's endangering society, and it's at a crisis, and therefore the only thing we can do is to use the Constitution and force compulsory abortion. This is the way they do it. This is what Principle 15 in the Agenda 21 is. That you don't need scientific proof. If you think that the planet's endangered, that then is all the justification you need for doing whatever you think you need to do to save the planet. And they use this argument and these straw men all the time, and in every issue. And there you see it with Holdren back in 1977 when that book was published.
Incredible, too, because even you can look at Fred Engels and Karl Marx. It's the same. Yep. It's a precursor to all this, isn't it, really? And, the interesting thing for people to know is Karl Marx was a self-proclaimed Satanist. A self-proclaimed Satanist. He was. Yep. Anybody can punch that in. It's unbelievable, And you've always said there's two kind of people that get into politics, and you know what the kind of people are when you see the graffiti in Pompeii, don't you?
Yeah, right. Well, the graffiti in Pompeii says that if we get rid of this bunch of scoundrels, we just get another bunch of scoundrels. But in a discussion I had years ago with Peter C. Newman, who's a Canadian journalist, and one of the old school, who didn't pull any punches. He said there are only two kinds of people that get into politics. Those that say, I've got some ideas that can help the country, and those that say, I've got some ideas that can help myself. And he said all that changes through time is the predominance of one group over the other. The problem is right now we're probably at about 98% that are in politics because they've got ideas that can help themselves. And, of course, Al Gore is precisely that kind of person. And it's a symptom of the time. And we've got a crisis of leadership at every single level of our society, from any local thing. Again, you go back to Horner's comment about start with the school board. And that's where you've got crisis. You've got crisis of leadership in industry. People they get into CEO jobs, and what's the first thing they do? Negotiate a contract where stock options and retirement deals that are unbelievable, and then once they've done that, of course, there's no incentive to do the good job because you're going to walk away with
That's why I really liked what Jesse Ventura did. He said, I'm going to run as an independent. I'm fed up with these two parties. I'm going to balance the budget and get out. I'm only going to run for one term. I mean, I think that speaks volume about somebody. And, of course, I want Joe to jump in here because, Joe, you know quite a bit about the climate debate as well, and I think it's incredible that this science has been completely, it's junk science hijacked for a green agenda. It's just absolutely incredible.
You're absolutely correct, Sheila. And hi, Tim. It's a pleasure to have you on and an honor. And I know we've been on together before. And your intelligence is far surpasses that of many of the people out there who claim to be, environmentalists. And you gave a great example of what an environmentalist can and cannot entail, and how vague that can be. But even we hear just an example, a headline like maybe 2 weeks ago I saw one that said GOP blocks $3 billion Obama green initiative, and every time I see headlines like that, I think of the Cylindras. I think of all the green energy companies that spent billions of taxpayer dollars, each individual company, all to go bankrupt. Due to mismanagement of money and payoffs and bribes, and it's just, and as you guys get into the debate of the ideology behind the global warming, whether it's man-made or climate change, however you want to phrase it. It's ridiculous to have the amount of evidence against the people who claim global warming is man-made and we need to tax it. They've fumbled the ball so many times. They've showed their hand so many times. The unfortunate part is the American people don't pay attention when that happens. And so we're still stuck in this debate. It's not just the climate that's changing. The solar system temperature is changing. It's not just something here on Earth. It's something happening with our sun and our galaxy. And people need to understand that, yes, global warming does have contributions from man, but it is nothing compared to what nature brings in. And this whole issue is about money. It's about control, and it's back to Agenda 21, just as you guys stated. And you guys are right on the money. It's just another scam to try to create crises and to profit from those crises.
Yeah, but Joe, there's an interesting part of this because, and Sheila and I have talked about this a little bit before, but the whole idea of the Club of Rome and the fact that industrial development that Maurice Strong has been pushing, and that's all based on Malthus. And Malthus created the argument that population would outgrow the food supply, the food resources. He was absolutely wrong, and the examples he gave were wrong. But Darwin took Malthus' essays on population with him on the voyage on the Beagle. Okay, that's the first thing. But more important, in the Club of Rome took the Malthus idea, and Holdren and Ehrlich and all of these people, Maurice Strong, and they said that not only would the population outgrow the food supply, but it would outgrow all of the resources, and it would outgrow them at an increasingly rapid rate because of industrialization, and therefore the industrialized nations are the problems, and that was what Strong said, we've got to get rid of them. But there's another side to this that is very important, and that is that Darwin, of course, was an atheist, and the science then, as a amoral and apolitical group, effectively got rid of religion as our reason for being here. In other words, they said, well, we're not here, there's no God, therefore we're not here for God's reason. Now, where you see that having huge impact, and, of course, where people like Holdren and all these people come out of is that if you went to a university in Europe at Darwin's time, there were only two faculties. There was the faculty of the humanities, which included religion and literature and all these other philosophy and so on. And then there was the natural sciences faculty. There was one faculty missing that is now the largest faculty in all universities, and that is the social sciences. All right, now the social sciences emerged because once you're not here for God's purpose, and I'm not necessarily pushing religion, but we need explanations for things, but once you're no longer here for God's purpose, then you've got to explain why we're here and how we're different from all the other animals. Now, what a lot of people don't know is that Darwin avoided the question of the huge gap between the evolutionary development of humans and all the other animals. And a guy by the name of Alfred Russel Wallace, who had written to Darwin, sent him a 42-page paper saying, look, here's the evolutionary theory, before Darwin even published. And then he kept saying to Darwin, well, how do you explain this vast difference in evolutionary development between humans and all the other animals? Well, Darwin just ignored it. In The Origin of the Species, he doesn't talk about humans at all. And of course, his buddies in the science community were pushing him to publish, to defeat Wallace, or to get out ahead of Wallace. But you left with this gap. And of course, say the social sciences were created to explain that. And okay,
you're correct.
Now,
and if I could just jump in here, you know, one example, you know, is I was reading through the psychiatry, the DSM-5 that is going to be in effect in October 2014 for psychiatrists to manual to diagnose different mental disorders. Well, you know, science is only correct until until the theories are proven to be incorrect by other theories.
Right.
And you know, and just in this example with the DSM-5, it stated in the history section that homosexuality was considered a mental deficiency or dysfunction until 1974, up until 1974. And now in DSM-5, they're saying, you know, a belief in a higher power or spiritual belief is considered a mental disorder. So it's subjective, and you know, were they right then, or are they right now? You know.
Well, and of course, but here's the problem: if you're not here for God's purpose, then you've got to say, well, what purpose are we here for? And they don't address that, which means then that you've got to say, well, we're the gods. Right? And you see this in, oh, well, we created this problem. Oh, but we can solve it too. We can do geoengineering. We can control everything. And so you see humans, because they lack a moral base and a philosophical base, or even an explanation of why we're here and why we're different than all the other animals, that leaves you with you being God. And you know, one of the things that Sheila and I talked about was one of the turning points in American education was the Scopes monkey trial in Tennessee. Well, what was that about? What it was about was a teacher was teaching creationism. And I'm not here to defend that or oppose it. All I'm saying, that's what he was teaching. So the science community took him to court and said, oh no, you've got to teach Darwin's evolutionary theory. But what did the courts rule? They ruled that they can only teach Darwin's evolutionary theory. Well, what are you so afraid of? Why not teach both and let people make up their own minds? And so by forcing the schools to teach only Darwin, you were as dogmatic as the only teaching creationism that you replaced. But you see, people didn't see that in those terms. But that's exactly what happened. And so what we've got now are people like Maurice Strong or Al Gore. They believe that they're greater than God, or that God doesn't exist, and therefore they're the ones that have to control the planet. They're the ones that have to decide how other humans shall live. They have this complex of superiority, of understanding and ideas and everything else, and they implement it through these vehicles like environmentalism and so on as a political agenda. And you know, I've forgotten what the name, Lysenkoism back in Russia, back in the 30s, where this biologist convinced the government that there was only one way of doing things, and that was the way it was. The government said, that's the way it is, that's the way it is. And anybody that dared to question it was got rid of. Well, that's the sort of thing that we're heading into now.
Well, it really is a new religion for a new age, is it not? I mean, that's really, it's incredible now that, you better worship Gaia. I mean, this is a very occultic, pantheistic kind of religion that's replacing, and look at this was staggering. And by the way, Joe, the DSM-5 that came out, and for anybody who doesn't know, that's a diagnostic training manual for psychologists. Dave Hodges and I will tell you, as, former mental health therapists, that the DSM-4 also, Joe, you'll love this one. It is just sickening that pedophilia is actually just considered a preference. So, I mean, that book is just a sci-fi. Don't even get me started on that. But here's the interesting thing.
That's lovely.
Yeah, that's really lovely. And by the way, Darwin also renounced his evolution on his, this evolution theory on his deathbed, which I found so fascinating. But springboarding to this, you better worship a rock. I mean, let's face it, Tim, we all have a vested interest in having clean water. Of course we do. And, of course, they're weaponizing water now. You got two Boone Pickens off there buying up more water than any private person. You've got the Nestle's, the Monsantos. I mean, it's absolutely really frightening what's going on with our water. But when you create these food shortages, when you have a failure of the food supply, when you have governments that are really being hucksters around your water, let's face it, we need water to think about water. We cannot live more than 3 days off water. So I think the point here is that, and you've sat on lots of national water committees, Tim, what's going on with the water.
Well, and of course, you see, it's the game they play is that, we're going to run out of it. Right, this is what, and they create terms
like peak oil.
Peak oil, exactly. And what happened with that? And by the way, these doomsayers, and there've been thousands of them throughout human history. Not one of them has been right, because if any one of them had been right, we wouldn't be here today. But they constantly move. That if once one of their lies is exposed, then they move to the next one. And I think that this is a very important thing that we should do over the next week or two, because I did a radio program about a month ago where we went back and looked at all of the predictions made. I mean, like David Suzuki here in Canada said there's 20 years left. Prince Charles, the dumbo-eared offspring of Prince Philip, who said there's 100 days left. And I think we're about 8 years into a 10-year prediction by some other person. And you go back and look at all of these predictions and that have been made in recent times. Not one of them has held up, but they can constantly come out with them. And, of course, what's going on here is what here's H.L. Mencken's comment about this, is that the whole aim of practical politics, and that's a deliberate word, the whole aim of practical politics is to keep the populace alarmed and hence clamorous to be led to safety by menacing it with an endless series of hobgoblins, all of them imaginary. And he said that almost 100 years ago.
Well, and who else said, let's offer up scary scenarios?
Oh, yeah.
And these hucksters are always saying, all we need is the right major crises, and what are they going to say? And the world will accept the new world order. And what's amazing to me, if the oceans are rising so high, here's a great point. Why do you have, Mr. Windbag buying, Al Gore? Why has he got the largest carbon footprint ever? And if he's claiming sea levels are rising so high, why has he got why does weeks later after saying that, why would he buy an 11,000 square foot oceanfront property? What is the logic in that?
Well, it's the classic of the old adage: don't do what I say, or don't do what I do what I say. And of course, this is what Chris Horner was pointing out, that these people tell other people how to live, but don't expect them to live the same way. And then the justification of, he has to fly in the jet in order to spread the message. Well, I heard exactly that argument because David Suzuki here in Canada is supposedly launching on his final cross-Canada tour. And in anticipation of the argument that, oh, well, you're going to burn a lot of carbon to do that, they're arguing, well, yeah, but it's necessary to spread the message. And so there's all kinds of rationalizations and ways of doing it when it suits their purpose. And but as I said, if you start with the assumption that everything you're told is a lie, you're not going to go far wrong.
Well, but I just want to know, where is the accountability? I mean, these, you've got Obama raking in money, Al Gore, how many, in this biofuel scam, how he's exploited the political agenda for a personal gain. We know that for years. And again, I mean, you said it. Lord Acton said, power corrupts absolutely.
Go ahead, Joe. Okay, but look at how Gore stumbled when he was asked about, well, didn't you meet with Ken Lay of Enron? And he never answered it. He never answered it.
He said many people met with Ken Lay.
Well, there was one particular meeting right in the White House with Bill Clinton, Al Gore, Ken Lay of Enron, and Lord Brown of British Petroleum.
That's right.
And at that meeting, they figured out the carbon credits and how they were going to be divided up. And Gore goes out and creates a company called General Investment Management, in which he wasn't specifically selling carbon credits, so they couldn't point the finger at him for that. But he was brokering carbon credits. And I remember the first, in 1 year of operation, he made $51 million out of that operation. But this, as I said, the one thing that people eventually, whether they understand or not, the one thing that really gets them angry is hypocrisy. And if you look up the word hypocrisy in the dictionary, there's a picture of Al Gore, and it was when somebody went to the local utility company and said, how big is Al Gore's electricity bill? And it turned out to be 20 times the average American bill. And then that was put out there. His hypocrisy was exposed. That did more damage to him than any other single thing against Al Gore. It was the beginning of the end. And this is what we need to do. We need to go back and say, look, this is what they said, and it hasn't happened. So
yeah, the chicken little sky is falling scenarios, and there's doomsday scenarios that these guys always, they like to churn this out in the echo chamber, all this rhetoric, but it's just disgusting that they never, ever have to be accountable. Nobody gets charged. These are actually very...
Sheila.
Joe, go ahead.
No, I just want to jump in, and I apologize if I missed out on, if you guys did touch on this, but what has happened in Australia with the carbon tax legislation going forward, being approved, and now it's being taken away. As they see it for hopefully what it is, which is a scam, a scam to create more another false bubble. But can this model be used for what Australia did? Can we, as nations, look at how this worked in Australia and say, no, this can't work here because X, Y, and Z. This is from what happened in there.
Joe, what happened in Australia? It's a model in a way, but unfortunately, there was something else that happened. Now, I should have a disclosure here because I worked with a group called the Galileo Movement, and I wrote a lot of stuff about CO2 and all of that they put out in sound bites for people. But that was before Abbott became the current prime minister who has scrapped the carbon tax plan. But again, it was hypocrisy and lies that were so blatant that the public just screamed. I mean, normally they just say, well, all politicians lie, so they just another lie. What big deal. But Julia Gillard, who was running for the prime ministership of Australia, She ran on the platform that there would never, ever be a carbon tax under her administration.
That's right.
She got elected, and within 3 months, she brought in a carbon tax. Why did she do it? Because she was in a coalition, and the group that were keeping her in power said, if you don't bring it in, we're going to abandon you, and you won't be prime minister anymore. And so she brought in the carbon tax. That angered people so much. Now, she got to keep her job, but not for very long. And when Abbott came along and said, hey, we'll get rid of the carbon tax. So that was a sort of a unique situation in Australia. The other thing is that in Australia, the population are much more vocal and much more active than in most any other country in the world. And they'll call you out quicker than anything in Australia. And so when Gillard did that, of course that was the beginning of the end of the carbon tax. Again, one of the ways that people need to understand what's going on. The IMF, by the way, just came out with reports asking all nations to look to introducing carbon taxes in all of their individual nations, and to adopt green energy.
I saw that.
Yeah. Okay. Now the reason for that is because at the Copenhagen conference in 2009, what they call the Conference of the Parties on Climate Change. That's the political organization that's doing the climate change issue. They operate on what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change are telling them. That's their science authority. Well, just prior to the meeting in Copenhagen in 2009, somebody leaked the documents, emails that were showing how these guys had corrupted the science. And, of course, it completely undermined that Copenhagen conference. Now, why was that so critical? The person who leaked those emails tried to leak them through a BBC reporter by the name of Hudson, Paul Hudson. He sat on them and didn't put them out there because he'd been threatened by these guys before, and he didn't publish them. So the person leaked them then through a Russian internet provider that couldn't be traced. They were very cleverly picked out. Out of about 300,000 emails, he picked 1,000, or she picked 1,000, that showed not the science was wrong, although there was a little bit of that, because they knew that the public wouldn't understand the corrupted science. But it showed that how they got rid of editors, how they cheated on peer review, were peer reviewing each other's papers. In other words, things they were doing that were morally and legally completely wrong. And of course, that was done to stop Copenhagen conference. Why? Because at the Copenhagen conference, they were planning to have the IMF take over a carbon tax on a global basis. It was going to become the agency and the clearinghouse for a global carbon tax. And that was why it was those leaking emails were so critical. Now, because they failed with that, the IMF, of course, are continuing as a UN agency, a chartered agency. They're continuing to push the IPCC, but instead of doing it now on an international level through the UN, they're trying to force every national government into doing it. And so that's what's happening there. They're trying to continue with the agenda of getting a carbon tax in every nation in the world. But of course, what they're finding out is that the IMF itself is in danger because the BRICS nations, that is Brazil, Russia, India, and China, have already set up their own form of IMF. So that you don't have to go cap in hand to the IMF for money to help you develop your economy. You now got an alternative. And, of course, Russia, India, and China have consistently opposed the global warming argument and the global warming issue. And, in fact, the Indian government, the Prime Minister of India, had a commission formed, And they came back and said, look, the science is not there, and besides, we've got much more important priorities, such as people starving to death. And so the IMF is really, really desperate, and so this is what they're doing. And it's all part of the whole pattern of things that have been going on.
Well, and the United Nations, as far as I'm concerned, needs to be shut down, and I'm tired
Absolutely.
of them always running around as, masquerading as Grand Peace Central, but come on.
Well, I've got one solution. I agree with you. It should be shut down. I remember back in 1986, I calculated from their own data that if you just eliminated first-class air travel for the UN, you'd save $480 million a year. I mean, it's just unbelievable. But if it was to continue, what I would propose is that we turn Jerusalem into an international city, which it truly is. It shouldn't be battled over by the religions. And then you put the United Nations headquarters in Jerusalem.
Interesting.
Put it right at the center of and get it out of New York, and New Yorkers would be glad to see the back of it anyway.
Well, Tim, you just finished a really interesting documentary, and I just want to remind people that we're going to take calls here starting now in the last half an hour of the program. Of course, as everyone probably does have the number, but if you're listening by phone, you can just actually press 1 on your phone, and you'll be put first priority into the queue. Our guest calling number is 661-244-9839, and again, that's 661-244-9839 if you have a comment or a question. And we don't screen our calls, and we take pride in that. So, let's keep the questions. Yeah. So
yeah, we usually do a good job with that, and our callers are great. So we're going to continue to take our calls. And question for Tim, Tim Ball, Sheila Zilinsky, or Joe Hagmann here. And we were talking about global warming, climate change, scientific fraud at the governmental, intergovernmental levels. There's so many, and Tim, we were just scratching the surface here. There's so many agencies set up through the United States government and through other governments. You have the American states. There's just so many non-governmental organizations that have their hooks into this, carbon tax, global warming initiative. It boggles the mind when you truly sit down to research it, how many rabbit holes it leads you down, and it's almost you feel like you're self-defeated. Like how can I even keep track of all this? How can I go through all this? And it's just a huge conglomeration of confusion done so on purpose to further their goal.
Yeah, well, the NGOs were introduced at the early days, actually in the League of Nations, and then they were reintroduced by Maurice Strong when he was setting up the Rio conference. And the NGOs dominated that conference, non-government organizations, not accountable to anybody, not elected by anybody, coming in with their own political agendas. And at the last conference of the parties on climate, there were 6,000 people in attendance. Over 3,000 of them were NGOs. And all paid for, their travel and everything else, paid for through the UN and through their national weather offices and so on. So, yeah, the use of those NGOs by Maurice Strong, of course, and it's the same as Obama, giving power and authority to people that are completely unaccountable, and yet they can have input. And it's like I was talking earlier, Sheila, about the Friends of the Earth at that hearing in Ottawa, where they had such a dominance and such an input, and yet no expertise whatsoever. Just simply, And so the one of the things about the Rio conference was the introduction of the idea of NGOs and the prominence that they were given. But you see, that's how Strong has worked. Strong works through those sorts of organizations by making them beholden to him, by giving them input at the very high levels, and therefore their importance is overinflated. But he's also the master of using bureaucracies. So when he set up the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it was done through the World Meteorological Organization, the UN agency. They are the ones that decide who are members, who are parts of the IPCC. And, of course, by controlling those weather agencies in every country in the world, you effectively control the politicians on the climate issue. Because if your weather agency is saying to the politician, well, look, this is what you've got to do, the politician says, well, hang on a minute. And oh, no, we're your experts. We know what's going on. So what Maurice Strong did was he put all of the power into those bureaucracies. And Mary McCarthy described all of this several years ago when she said, bureaucracy, the rule of no one, the modern form of despotism. And you see this, of course, Obama's done this superbly as well with the EPA and all of these agencies that are bureaucracies and really accountable to nobody. And, of course, Chris talking about how they covered themselves, how they controlled their power, set up their power, protected their power, and made themselves completely unaccountable to anybody for anything. And, of course, the sad thing is they all walk away with big fat pensions and away they go.
Yeah, they're even allowed to write, they're even allowed to change the laws now through the Federal Register by writing regulation per agency head themselves. That's how bad it's gotten when it comes to the availability of the corruption of the laws.
Yep. And of course, then you add into that the fact that the politicians are now, the majority are there to advance their own careers, not what's good for the people. So you this is why Congress has got a rating of 11% amongst the people. It doesn't matter whether you're Democrat or Republican. You're simply there for your own career.
Okay, Tim, I'm going to jump in. We got a wall of calls, so let's get to some phone calls.
Yeah.
All right, let's do that. And we have Tim Ball with us, with Sheila Zilinsky on the Weekend and Hagmann report. We have about 28 minutes left, so we're going to try and keep the calls quick, to the point, with a question. We're going to go to area code 610 first. 610, thank you for holding. You're live on the Hagmann report with Sheila Zilinsky and Tim Ball. What's on your mind tonight?
Good evening, everybody. What I was listening to tonight and what I haven't heard at all was about the drive of what climate change is. There is climate change. There's no doubt. Climate change is every single day you wake up. It gets warmer, it gets colder. But climate is changing on this planet, and like you had said, on every other planet. It's that big yellow thing up there. And the fact that where we're moving through interstellar track of space with a cloud that we've never been through before in our perception. And it's causing our planet to change on a scale that, as humans, I don't know if we've ever seen it before, but it's new to us. And I think they knew a lot of this beforehand, and the sun just didn't play along back when they were espousing global warming. And when the sun started putting out less sunspots and stopped fluffing up our atmosphere as much, and we didn't warm as much. When the sun doesn't have as many sunspots, that's when we go through ice ages, and there's more CO2 been found during ice ages than ever when it was warm.
So, caller, let me ask you this: should we be taxing the sun and the ocean? How about that plan?
Well, that's my whole point. I mean, you can shovel money out the door like crazy. In fact, I thought that would make a hilarious video. Make up, honey, help! We got to fight global warming. Just start throwing money out the door. It's ridiculous to think that man is causing the global warming. I mean, I agree with we should never take a dump where we're going to eat. We shouldn't let open pollution go in that lets our carcinogens that cause us cancer. We also shouldn't be spraying things above our heads and dumping things in the oceans, but that's another story altogether.
Caller, can I interrupt for just a second? Because this was all orchestrated. What you're pointing out is absolutely correct. You see, and Sheila's heard me tell this story before, the public think that commissions of inquiry are great because they say, oh, finally we're going to get the politics out of the issue. Okay? Now, when the first commission of inquiry I was appointed to, I found out exactly what goes on with commissions of inquiry because it was about debate or argument between people over the levels in a lake, okay? And so I was put on the Commission of Inquiry to look into this. We then got the terms of reference of what data we could get and what we could look at. That list of terms of reference was so narrow that it predetermined the outcome. So in other words, the politicians and the bureaucrats got together and said, look, we don't want anybody digging into this stuff. We want a certain outcome, and therefore we're going to limit the terms of reference. And I remember when Judge Warren, who was investigating, he was looking at the Kennedy assassination, and he was on the television and said, why didn't you look at the Dallas Mafia connection, Jack Ruby and that? He said it wasn't in my terms of reference. Okay, I knew exactly what he was saying. Most of the public don't know. Now, here's my point. When Maurice Strong set up the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to look at climate change, and you're absolutely right, the climate changes all the time. It's perfectly normal. What's going on now is well within natural variability, but they're pretending or leading you to believe it isn't. But what they did was they wrote a definition of what the IPCC should look at. And the definition was that they only look at human causes of climate change. Now, the thing with that is, that means don't look at the sun, don't look at what's going on in interstellar space, and your argument about galactic arms of dust and so on are all perfectly valid, but don't look at any of that, only look at human causes, which meant that they were effectively narrowed down to CO2, which of course is what they wanted them to look at. But the public are led to believe, even with comments in their own reports, that they're looking at all of climate science and all of climate change, but they're not. They're doing what they were directed to do. And of course then they come up and say, well, you know, we've got absolute, we're 97% certain that human CO2 is causing the climate change. Well, you can't possibly say that if you don't know what the other factors, natural factors of climate change are. But this was deliberately done, and as I said, you can go and look at the definition. Yeah, this is all part of the orchestration. But all of your comments about the sun and
right down to the people coming up from the south of the border as well. It's all been planned for a long time, and its agendas being moved forward by principalities. And I'm going to let it go with this, but I've gotten on a couple times and I said this is all connected. It's been in play longer than we've been alive, and it's just coming to fruition now. You have a wonderful night, and God bless. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Okay, Joe, we got another caller.
I think maybe, I don't know, am I still on, Tim? Because I think we're having some studio issues. Can you still hear me? Okay. Joe, are you still there? I don't know if Joe's on or not. Joe Hagmann, are you still there? Well, I don't know where Joe is, but we'll take another caller, 936. Welcome to the program. What is on your mind? I think I've got control of the studio. Maybe I don't. Just hold on, Tim.
I'm back, Sheila. Sorry about that.
But you better take it because I'm not. No, I'm getting kicked out of the studio too. So
we have
caller 936. Yeah, what's on your mind?
Oh, it's Mike in the big thicket of East Texas. How are you guys doing tonight?
Hey, Mike. What's your question or comment?
Great, Mike. Thanks.
Well, I'm a conspiracy guy. Been there, done that for a while. And it seems to me that you got corruption on all levels. And if people don't know already, the votes aren't fixed. So forth. Guys,
I think we're kind of you're cutting out a little bit, caller.
I'm sorry. Are you guys believers in aliens? I was abducted at 14 years of age, and sure that was just real as a heart attack. There are so many agendas going on that are against the American people, and we've been cheated out of a bunch.
Yeah, Mike, if I can jump in with that, one of the we had a caller, Sheila and I, on a program once where said America's the last hope for freedom and freedom of speech and so on, and we pointed out, no, you're the first ones, you're the only ones that have that. And of course, one of the things that people don't like is success. They like it for themselves, but they don't like it in other people. And there's two ways to get ahead. You can pull yourself up or you can push the other person down. And it's so much easier to push the other person down. So America, and you see it with the Jewish people. I mean, no matter where they've gone, they've been successful, and they become despised for it. Well, America, of course, represents success. And not only that, but America represents the first time in the history of humanity that individuals have had control over their own lives and their own property. The private ownership of property, which is critical to the United States, beyond getting rid of monarchy and having your own people elected. So the United States represents every single thing that all of the powerful people throughout history have despised, and therefore you're the target of these attacks. And I mean, Maurice Strong, raised in a socialist family. In fact, his sister is a lifelong declared Marxist. And yet he went to the States and made a lot of money as an industrialist. And what does he say? Oh, well, what was it, Sheila, that I'm a socialist?
He said that he's a capitalist by his, how he thinks in terms of business, but he's a socialist on the other hand.
Yeah, exactly. So this is the kind of people that despise success and despise what America represents, despises the fact that each individual has the freedom that they've got, and of course are doing everything they can to take that away. And This is really the battle that's going on. The Founding Fathers understood all of this. They understood that people were basically not good and that you had to start with that assumption. They understood that freedom of speech was absolutely critical to every single thing. And then not only that, but they realized that you were going to have to defend that freedom of speech, and they gave you the Second Amendment to do that. So the Founding Fathers knew exactly what they were doing, but of course it was genius. I think the critical issue now for the United States and for the world is that America now is confronted with the second stage of what's unique about America, and that is rejecting the overthrow of what it's all about and is able to maintain it. And that's the real challenge. Will the people stand up and be counted? And as we know, the Founding Fathers said that as well. You're going to be tested. You're going to have to take to the streets to defend what we have created for you. And so I think that's the stage that you're at right now. So, yeah, I'm with you, Mike, in Texas. I'm a conspiracy theorist. But don't forget, this is a way that they marginalize people. Oh, you're a conspiracy theorist, like you're some nut job, like conspiracies don't occur.
Or in your case, Tim, a climate denier. You're a denier.
There you go. Of course.
Yes. Okay, let's move along.
Hey, I'm a DHS agent, so, we all have our crosses to bear.
There you go. Yeah, exactly.
All right, we're going to move along here. We're going to go to 772. 772, thanks for holding. You are live on the Hagmann Hagmann Report with Tim Ball and Sheila Zilinsky. What's on your mind tonight?
Hi, I was just calling to respond to what Dr. Ball said, and I agree 100%. The UN should move to Jerusalem, then let Hamas fire all the rockets in and see what the story will be then. God bless you guys.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, who is it? Samuel Johnson said, "Nothing gets your attention like the threat of a hanging," and so yeah, put them right in the bullseye and see how they respond. But of course, as somebody said, that politicians are very good at sending other people out to get killed for them. And the UN is just that. But, I mean, personally, I'd get rid of it altogether because the only thing you get with bigger government is bigger corruption, nothing else. And so my real option is for getting rid of the UN. But if you have to have it and you have to move it anywhere, put it in Jerusalem. Thank you, caller.
Tim, one of our callers called in and I think coined the term bulldoze it or push it into the ocean, and I think that's a more proper place for it than Jerusalem. But
you want to pollute the ocean some more, do you?
In this case, it might be worth it. We're going to move right along to another caller, area code 951. 951, we're coming to you. You're live on the Hagmann and Hagmann Report. What's your question today?
First of all, thank you very much for all of your great work. Every one of you is an individual contribution, and those of us out here so appreciate it. But I wonder how anyone can talk about climate and not talk about the chemtrails or geoengineering. I live in California, and we don't have much time left if they continue to do what they're doing. Shasta County finally was the first civil government agency to address the situation, and they're saying the soil and the water is so polluted and the ozone's opened up and the trees are being burned. And, yes, mankind is affecting the weather through this system, and maybe that's how they want to continue to pay for it, is through this carbon tax. But it's not our factories, it's not us breeding, it's not our cows. But I wonder if any of you have any comments on that. I mean,
I have a comment. I definitely have a comment that I'd like to get Tim to touch on about this big hole in the ozone. Tim, why don't you take that away?
Yeah, well, there's a hole in the ozone. There never was a hole. But just to respond to the caller's call for a minute, I was in the Canadian Air Force, and we were doing anti-submarine work, and I know all of the experiments that were going on and all of the electronic warfare and chemical warfare, and you know, everybody was concerned about nuclear warfare, but chemical and biological warfare is far more frightening, and we're far more vulnerable. You know, when you figure there are dioxins, that just a few ounces of it in New York City water supply would kill everybody. But with regard to the chemtrails, there's two things going on here. One is that there has been an increase in condensation trails, which are natural when an aircraft flies. Aircraft are flying at higher altitudes. They're now flying in the lower stratosphere, where the effects of their exhaust is much more visible, lingers much longer, and they spread out over greater distances. But having said that, the government are putting the chemtrails up supposedly in an experiment to stop the warming, to block the sunlight and see if they can control warming. So they're responding to the false claim of global warming. And of course, this is what happens when governments think they can play God. The same sorts of things were being done by government back in the 1970s when global cooling was the threat. And there were all sorts of ideas about, we should do this, we should put big reflectors up in space to direct more sunlight down to northern cities, and that there was a proposal to put a dam across the Bering Straits and stop the cold Arctic water getting into the North Pacific, and on and on and on. But, you know, if you don't know what the mechanisms are and you don't know how nature works, you're far better to do nothing. And I think the chemtrails thing is a perfect example of governments thinking that they're God, thinking that they can resolve things. And by the way, caller, the sorts of things they've done, they spread massive amounts of iron filings across the North Pacific on the surface of the water, without any concern about how that changed the water chemistry, but they were trying to change the water chemistry to make the algae in bloom, which would then absorb more CO2. So they figured they could cause the oceans to absorb more CO2 by spreading those iron filings. So whenever government gets involved in anything, it's almost always for the wrong reason, and almost always ends up causing a worse problem than there was in the first place.
Well, I have to just look at our weather in the United States when California hasn't rained since November, although we did get sprinkles today, and then the rest of the country is inundated. So, I mean, it's obvious.
Sorry, let me explain that for you. John Holdren talked about the polar vortex out of the White House. He did a 2-minute video, as if this was something new, and as if it was an explanation for what he was presenting as bizarre weather. What he's talking about is actually the circumpolar vortex. That's the jet stream blowing around in the middle latitudes and pushing down into northern California and California. But there are waves in those jet streams called Rossby waves, which we've known about since 1946. And the number of waves and the amplitude of those waves changes as the sun changes. And what we're seeing are changes in the sun, not new, not unusual, related to not related or caused by sunspots, but related to sunspot activity. So what is happening is perfectly explainable, perfectly normal, if you know climate science and if you know the long-term history. The pattern of climate in California is what we call a Mediterranean climate, because it's similar to the latitude of the Mediterranean in Europe. And it's identified, it's a relatively unique climate form around the world, but it's ideal for humans because what you get is warm, dry, sunny summers, and then you get cooler, wetter winters. And that is a classic California climate. But when these jet stream waves change, then you go through drought cycles, and drought cycles in California are perfectly normal. And of course, it's why the state of California, particularly Southern California, has got into all of these irrigation and water diversions and bringing water from the Colorado River and so on and so forth, and the irrigation of the Imperial Valley and so on. All of these things are a result of trying to overcome the natural pattern of weather in California.
I invite you to my home so you can watch when they're spraying, and you can see how they form into these clouds and take tests of the aluminum in the soil and water. And Monsanto has come out with all their new seeds that are in their new products, which are aluminum resistant. I think there is something there. There is something going on. Hey, I appreciate your expertise. Yep. Thank you very much. And, bottom line, thank God there's a God.
Yeah, right.
And it's not man.
No, amen. Yeah. Well, let's caller, being God is a very hard job. I tried it at home, and it's very difficult.
Thank you. Love you guys. Love you all.
Thank you.
Love you too. God bless you. Guys, we have time. We have about 7 minutes left. We have another 2 calls. We can try to get to both. We can get to one. You guys want to at least take one of the calls?
Yeah, sure.
All right.
As long as I don't talk too long.
I'll make sure we're keeping it in time. 808 area code. You're live. Thanks for holding. You're live on the Hagmann Hagmann Report with Sheila, Zilinsky, and Tim Ball. What's on your mind?
Hey, aloha, y'all. This is a quiet guy calling. I'd like to just suggest about the climate, about the chemtrailing and the climate thing, about, particularly the chemtrails. I'd like to suggest possibly, if anybody read Xenogenesis, I haven't read the book, but I am familiar with that chapter about Dr. Langley, Mr. Langley, that was submitted, that the rainbow, the frequency, was a barrier to, the rainbow frequencies was a barrier to the evil entities coming into this dimension. And I'd just like to suggest that the chemtrailing, all that stuff, is a mechanism to destroy that barrier that God provided, for the, the Testament. That, the frequency barrier. I think they're trying to break down that frequency barrier that God provided to block the evil entities from this dimension. That's all.
Yeah, just some comments about that. Having been involved in the military and with communications and so on, communications for military has been a huge issue. And one of the things that they've been working on is the ionosphere and what's called the F layer. Now, it became less important once we got satellites up there. And for example, the Soviet Union, well, actually early Germany had a huge problem with communicating with their submarines all around the world, and they were working with extremely low frequencies. But during the Cold War, there were huge battles going on because the Soviet Union, or Russia's the largest country in the world, but it's got the most inaccessible coastline. The idea of Slavic paranoia, of feeling trapped, is very real. And of course, their concern was if the balloon went up, their whole Navy was out there, and they had to be able to communicate with them. So once the satellites went up, they felt more secure. But then the Americans developed the ability to shoot down other satellites. So the Soviets started experimenting with these ultra or extremely low frequencies again, and it showed up in Scandinavia where they were swamping all of the radio and TV signals. A lot of people interpreted that as energy to affect the climate. In fact, the amounts of energies involved are insignificant in affecting climate, but certainly what's happening in the layers of the atmosphere, the protective layers, the magnetic field that protects us from harmful radiation from space and from the sun, these are all very, very critical things. And of course, Sheila was talking about the ozone layer. That's a layer that protects us. It's actually created by ultraviolet radiation striking oxygen molecules, which then separate O2 separates into O, single oxygen, which then quickly reform into O3, which is ozone. That protects us from harmful ultraviolet radiation from the sun. So those protective layers are very, very important to life on Earth.
Absolutely.
Fantastic.
It's so true, Joe. Here's the bizarre thing, like Tim just touched on the geoengineering. I mean, these are real sci-fi things that the government is doing in the name of protecting us that are causing more disastrous scenarios. So, when you fire metal filings or firing into the Pacific Ocean, I mean, that has huge implications. Well, we've got about 1 minute to wrap it up, Tim. And just thank you so much for coming on tonight. Folks, I'd really like to encourage everyone to go to weekendvigilante.com, click on Tim Ball there, and of course it takes you directly to his website. He does an amazing blog, incredible book that he just wrote, folks, and Tim has battled so many legal cases for being a so-called denier, and like I said, it's really important to support people like Chris, people like Tim, people that are actually doing the work, taking on these hucksters. We can't, we can't all do everything, but we need to be supporting these people, and I think that's really important.
Joe, what's more important is not necessarily that people agree with me, like that lady from California. In fact, disagreement is healthy. Debate is absolutely essential to the human condition, and it's programs like this and the right to speak out that's far more critical in a way than what we're even saying. That's the issue.
You're right. You're right. Now, I did a piece yesterday on tolerance and how tolerance is not tolerating something you agree with. It's tolerating the real definition of tolerance is being respectful and open-minded to something you don't agree with. An essential element of tolerance is disagreement, and we've lost that in today's society. But Dr. Tim, it's been a blessing to have you back on. I want to thank you so much for spending your time with us tonight. I hope to have you again soon. Anytime the schedule can work that out.
Thank you. I'm happy to come back at any time. Thank you, Sheila.
Well, folks, thank you so much for tuning in, folks, and thank you, Tim. Thank you, Joe. Thank you for your calls tonight, folks, and again for tuning in. And I want to just thank everyone for, keeping us in your prayers. Folks, do support us with your prayers and also with your finances too, because as you guys know, it takes a lot of work to run a program like this and bring you the best guests and high quality show. And I really hope that you think it's something worth supporting. I know that some people get paid the big bucks to bring you lots of crap in the lamestream news like clown news, but we actually do present the news in 3D, and we only bring you the people that we feel are telling the truth, are really battling these situations, and I hope you do support the show. So, Joe, I thank you for tuning in tonight as well. And final thoughts?
Sheila, you did a fantastic job with the first interview, and definitely hit another home run with the second interview. All these Saturday shows have been such a blessing and a learning experience for me as I've had an opportunity to sit back and listen, and I thank you for the great job and energy you put into putting this together. You do a fantastic job, and we can't give you enough credit.
Well, thank you, and God bless you guys, and we'll see you at the same bat time, same bat cave next Saturday night, only here on the Weekend Report.
God bless. Good night, everyone.
Good night.